They say a king's greatest weapon is his crown. They're wrong. His greatest weapon is the woman beside him who never lets him fall, the one who patches the cracks in his walls while he's too busy admiring his own reflection. Alpha King Darius Thorn had that woman. He had her loyalty, her silence, her sacrifice. And on the night of the Moonfire banquet, before every lord, every warrior, every soul who swore breath to his throne, he chose to throw her away for a woman who smelled like imported perfume and borrowed power. Drop your city in the comments. Stay until the end, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about strength.
Us.
The Palace of Thornvale had been built on bones. Not the bones of enemies, though there were plenty of those buried in the foundation stones if you knew where to dig. The bones that truly held the citadel upright were the invisible kind, the years of sleepless negotiation, the cold meals eaten standing over maps, the letters drafted and redrafted at midnight when the king slept soundly and his Luna sat alone with a quill and a lantern and the full weight of the kingdom pressing against the back of her skull. Luna Celine Ashcroft knew every crack in this palace. She had filled most of them herself. She stood in the corridor outside the Grand Moonfire Hall and listened to the noise on the other side of the double doors. 1,000 candles blazed in there. 1,000 guests laughed and ate and clinked glasses of dark wine. The Moonfire banquet was held once every 5 years when the twin moons aligned directly overhead and the pack bloodlines renewed their oaths to the crown. It was the single most important political event in the kingdom's calendar. Every alpha of every border pack would be present tonight. Every elder council seat would be filled. The foreign trade delegations from the Eastern River clans had traveled 3 weeks by horse just to attend. Celine had spent 4 months preparing this banquet. She had negotiated the seating arrangements personally, navigating 17 separate blood feuds and 2 contested territorial borders without a single duel breaking out at the table. She had arranged the ceremonial coursework, sourced the vintage from the southern vineyards, written the formal oaths of renewal that would be spoken at midnight, and vetted every servant and kitchen hand against the palace security roles. She had done all of this while managing the ongoing drought relief effort in the eastern provinces, finalizing the new trading charter with the Ironmere packs, and handling 4 consecutive audiences with pack leaders who refused to speak to anyone but the Luna because the king had been, as one elder alpha from the Northern Ridge had put it, with the diplomatic restraint of a man trying very hard not to say something much worse, unavailable. She smoothed the front of her silver ceremonial gown with both hands. The fabric was the color of moonlight on water. Her hair, the long silver-white hair that fell to the middle of her back, the hair that pack law considered the sacred physical mark of a bonded Luna's status, had been braided and pinned with the traditional wolf-thorn crown of woven silver wire. She had dressed herself tonight. Her usual handmaidens had been sent to assist with the banquet floor preparations. There had not been enough hands. There were never enough hands when you were the only one doing the work. She pushed both doors open and walked in. The hall was magnificent. She could say that without vanity because she had built it. Not the stone walls and the vaulted ceiling. Those were Darius's ancestors' work. But everything inside it tonight was hers. The long tables arranged to honor the Eastern tradition of circular sight lines so that no pack sat with their back to another. The moonfire lanterns suspended at exactly the height where the candlelight would hit the silver ceiling tiles and scatter into something that looked like living stars. The centerpiece arrangements of white thornbloom, which grew only in the northern valleys and which she had commissioned 6 months in advance because you could not rush a thornbloom into season regardless of how much gold you threw at a gardener. For one breath, standing at the entrance of the hall she had built, Celine let herself feel something close to pride. Then she found Darius. He was at the head table. Of course he was. He was always easy to find in a room because he occupied space the way very few men did. Not just the chair he sat in, but the 3 feet of air around him, charged and certain and magnetic in the way that apex wolves had been since the first packs ran the old forests before memory. Darius Thorn was a physically stunning man. Celine had never been able to deny that fact, even when she hated him, and lately the 2 things existed simultaneously inside her without much difficulty. Broad through the shoulders, dark hair cut close, eyes the color of deep amber that caught the candlelight and held it. a jaw built for portraits and coin faces. He was laughing. She did not immediately understand what she was seeing, or rather, she understood the individual components, the way you can understand each word in a sentence, while your mind refuses to assemble them into meaning, because the meaning, once assembled, cannot be taken apart again. Darius was laughing, head tilted back, one arm draped along the top of the chair beside him. And in that chair, leaning into the casual warmth of his arm, with the practiced ease of a woman who had been practicing it for some time, sat Lady Vivian Crest. Celine stopped walking. Lady Vivian was 31 years old, which was 11 years younger than Celine. She was the daughter of the Lord of Crestfall, a mid-tier coastal pack whose strategic value lay primarily in their shipping routes, and whose social value had always been their extraordinary talent for spending money they borrowed from better-established families. Vivian had attended court for 2 years. She had dark hair and a face built for the specific purpose of being looked at, and she wore it with the confidence of someone who had never been required to justify her presence in a room through any means other than existing in it beautifully. She was wearing deep crimson tonight, the color of a pack leader's mate. Not quite the silver of a Luna. Vivian was not that stupid, or perhaps not yet that bold, but crimson, which was as close to a declaration as you could wear on your body without technically having made one. And she was sitting at the head table. The head table, where the seating had been arranged by Celine herself weeks ago, where Vivian's name did not appear anywhere on the placement chart, where the chair to the right of the king had been designated for the elder alpha of the Black Ridge Pack who had traveled 6 days to be here, and whose alliance to the crown was worth 3 full divisions of border warriors. Celine looked down the head table. Elder Alpha Harkon of Black Ridge was seated 4 chairs away, next to a lesser lord of no particular consequence, wearing the face of a man who had noticed exactly where he was sitting and had already made several internal decisions about his future loyalty to this crown. Celine began walking again. No one had noticed her yet. The hall was loud with conversation and wine and the self-important noise of several hundred powerful people performing their own significance at each other. She moved along the outer edge of the hall, watching, cataloging, the way she always did in rooms like this. Reading the microgeography of who was standing close to whom, who had turned their shoulder to a neighboring delegation, where the tension lived in a man's jaw when he thought no one was watching his face. What she read was not good. The Eastern River clans were clustered together near the far end of the second table with their backs to the central dais, which was not the open posture of guests who felt welcomed. The 2 northern border alphas who had been feuding over the Greymere territory were seated incorrectly. Someone had moved them back to opposite sides of the hall after Celine's carefully engineered placement had put them deliberately adjacent, which meant that the proximity conversation she had designed to happen organically over the first 2 courses was not going to happen, and the Greymere dispute would go another season without resolution. 3 of the Elder Council members were huddled in conference near the eastern archway with expressions that Celine recognized from 14 years of reading rooms. That particular combination of worried and calculating that meant something had already gone wrong tonight, and they were debating what to do about it. She reached the head table. She walked directly to her seat, the seat to Darius's left, the Luna's seat, the seat that had been hers for 14 years, and she sat down. Darius turned his head. The laughter faded into something more guarded. "Celine," he said. Not her name as a greeting, her name as an acknowledgement of a complication. "My king." She reached for the water glass in front of her. Her hand was steady. She had trained it to be. "I see we've had some adjustments to the seating arrangements." "Lady Vivian had some trouble finding her table," Darius said. "I had her moved closer so she wouldn't be lost." Celine set the glass down. "Elder Alpha Harkon of Black Ridge rode 6 days to be seated at your right hand tonight. That placement was not decorative, it was diplomatic. Harkon is fine where he is. Harkon is 4 seats away from the crown at the most important pack assembly of the decade, and he knows exactly why." She kept her voice even and low, the professional voice, the one that had talked 3 separate territorial disputes back from the edge of open warfare. "He brought 40 border warriors with him. That's 40 warriors whose oaths we're currently in the process of winning, not inheriting. Every hour he sits where he's sitting instead of where he was supposed to be sitting is an hour that goodwill is draining out of this room." Vivian leaned forward slightly on Darius's other side. "Perhaps the Luna is overcomplicating a simple seating matter." Her voice was light, the studied lightness of a woman who had calculated exactly how much condescension she could wrap in pleasantness before it became undeniable. Celine did not look at her. "My king," she said, still to Darius, still in the even professional voice, though something beneath her sternum had gone very cold. "I need 2 minutes of your attention before the formal proceedings begin." "The evening has already started, Celine." "It is. And the way it continues depends on what happens in the next 2 minutes. I'm asking for 2 minutes." Darius's jaw shifted. He had a tell, a slight tightening of the muscle beneath his ear when he was being asked to do something he did not want to do but could not publicly refuse. Celine had memorized that tell so long ago she couldn't remember learning it. "Later," he said. "There won't be a later for Harkon. His mood will set before the third course." "I said later." Quieter now. The quieter voice was the warning voice. "Enjoy the evening, Luna. This is a celebration." Vivienne made a small sound that was almost a laugh, quickly smoothed into a delicate cough. The kind of sound a woman makes when she knows she's winning something. Celine looked at her then, directly, for the first time. Vivienne met her eyes with the specific confidence of someone who had been told, or had correctly intuited, that she had nothing to fear from the woman sitting across from her. Dark eyes. Beautiful. Utterly hollow of any understanding of what it cost to hold the thing she was currently trying to take. Celine looked away, not from weakness, from the simple recognition that nothing she said to Vivienne in the next 30 seconds would matter, and she had other problems in this room that actually could be solved before midnight. She spent the first 2 courses doing the work she always did, moving through the room between formal segments, speaking quietly to Elder Harkon, for 11 minutes in the precise combination of deference and directness that the old alpha responded to, convincing him without ever quite saying so explicitly that the seating arrangement had been a logistical error rather than a political statement. She renegotiated the placement of the Eastern Clan representatives into a better conversation cluster without anyone realizing she had done it. She extracted the 2 northern border alphas from their opposite corners and engineered an accidental hallway encounter near the wine station that lasted long enough for old grudge ice to crack slightly at the edges. She did all of this while watching Darius at the head table. He was not watching her work. He rarely did anymore. Not because he didn't know she did it, but because knowing and seeing were different things, and it was easier not to see. Easier to sit at the head of the table he had inherited and accept the results of her labor as though results simply appeared, as though kingdoms held themselves together through the gravity of titles rather than through the invisible daily grinding work of someone who understood that power was not a possession but a process. He was watching Vivienne. Celine stood near the eastern archway and watched him watch Vivienne and let herself, for just a moment, actually feel it. Not perform feeling it while remaining functional. Actually feel it. The way you press on a bruise sometimes, just to confirm it's still there. 14 years. She had been 17 when the bonding ceremony bound her to Darius Thorne's household and his future. She had been 17 and small and terrified and absolutely determined not to show it, in a great hall full of pack alphas who were measuring her worth the way men measured everything, by whether her surface qualities matched the requirements of the position she was filling. She had spent 14 years becoming indispensable through the only avenue available to her. Not beauty, though she had that. Not bloodline, though that was there too. Competence. Raw, unresting, meticulous competence. The kind that doesn't let you sleep until the work is done and wakes you before dawn to start the next problem. She had built this kingdom's current stability with her own hands, and the king whose name was on everything had spent the last 2 years dismantling it. One bad decision at a time while she ran behind him quietly, fixing the damage before anyone noticed it was broken. She pressed the bruise. She walked back to the head table and sat down and lifted her glass and smiled at the elder councilwoman across from her who was watching her with the specific expression of a woman who had seen a great deal of courts and had recently seen something that distressed her. And Celine held the smile until the councilwoman relaxed slightly and returned it. The midnight ceremony began. The formal structure of the Moonfire Oath Renewal was ancient and specific. The king stood at the center dais, the Luna at his right hand, and each pack alpha in turn approached to renew their blood oath to the crown. The oaths were spoken in the old tongue, short, brutal phrases that had remained unchanged for 200 years because some things were too foundational to revise without unraveling everything built on top of them. When each alpha spoke the oath, the Luna was required to respond with the counterphrase that completed the binding, acknowledging the pack into the kingdom's protection. It was not decorative. In pack law, the Luna's counterphrase was the actual legal mechanism of the oath. Without it, the binding was incomplete. Celine had written those counterphrases from memory at age 18, the first time she had stood at this dais. She rose from the head table with Darius and walked to the central dais and took her position at his right hand. The hall hushed. 1,000 people turned to face the crown, and then Darius turned to the head table. "Lady Vivian," he said. His voice carried across the silent hall easily. The voice of an alpha bred for rooms like this. "Stand with me tonight." The silence in the Grand Moonfire Hall was the specific silence of a very large number of people simultaneously understanding something and collectively deciding, in real time, whether to believe it. Celine did not move. She stood at his right hand with her face arranged into complete stillness and felt the cold thing beneath her sternum spread outward through her chest, into her arms, into the tips of her fingers. It moved like floodwater, slow and total and irreversible. Vivian rose from her chair. She did not hurry. She moved through the space between the head table and the central dais with the deliberate grace of a woman who had rehearsed this moment, or something very close to it, and she came to stand at Darius's left. Not his right. His left. The secondary position. But she was on the dais, at the ceremonial center of the kingdom's most sacred political ritual, at the Moonfire Oath Renewal, on the dais. The hall still had not made a sound. Elder Alpha Harkon of Black Ridge was standing at the front of the oath queue, 20 feet from the dais, and his face had gone entirely still in the way of a man who had just seen something that changed several calculations at once. Darius looked out at the hall, at his kingdom, at the 1,000 faces frozen in the candlelight. "Let the oaths begin," he said. Celine looked at the side of his face. The jaw she knew. The ear she knew. The place where the Tell lived when he didn't want to do something. There was no Tell right now. He had decided this and was not conflicted about it, and the absence of conflict in his face was, in a way that she had not expected, the thing that broke something open. Not the presence of Vivian, not the insult of the positioning, not the political catastrophe of what was unfolding in front of 300 pack alphas and every elder council seat and the foreign trade delegations who would carry reports of this night back to their own leaders. His certainty. The complete absence of doubt in his face about the choice he was making. After 14 years of her standing at that right side, after 14 years of counterphrases and dawn meetings and drought negotiations and alliance building and all the invisible grinding competence work that had filled in every crack of his reign, his face in this moment held no uncertainty at all. She had known, she realized. She had known for some time in the way you know things you are not ready to act on. She had filed the knowing carefully away behind the work, behind the next problem and the next fix and the next negotiation, because as long as there was work to do, she could remain in motion, and a thing that you are in motion away from cannot catch you. It had caught her. Elder Alpha Harkon stepped forward to deliver his oath. The hall held its collective breath. Celine reached up. The gesture was small, both hands rising to her head, finding the wolf-thorn silver crown. Unpinning it. Her fingers moved to her braided hair, finding the pins that held the ceremony braid, pulling them free one by one in a silence so complete that the small metal sounds of each pin dropping into her palm were audible to the nearest tables. People were watching her now. She could feel it, the slow reorientation of attention from the king on the dais to the Luna standing beside him, unpinning her ceremonial hair. She let the braid fall loose, silver white hair, down her back. Harkon had stopped 3 feet from the dais. He was watching her. His oath remained unspoken. Celine looked along the left side of the dais to the ceremonial weapons display, the traditional bladed artifacts mounted on the dais rail for the Moonfire ceremony, the knives and short blades that represented the bloodline history of the Thorn dynasty. One of them was the silver blade, short, slightly curved, with a handle of dark thornwood. It had been used twice in recorded kingdom history, both times by women, both times in circumstances not entirely unlike this one. She stepped to the rail. She lifted the silver blade from its mount. Its weight was slight. It had been designed for a specific purpose, and that purpose did not require mass. "Celine," Darius's voice behind her, low and hard, the warning voice. "What are you doing?" Not a question. She gathered her loose silver hair in one fist, pulled it taut, and cut. The blade was sharp enough that she barely felt resistance. The hair fell in a single clean mass into her left hand, 18 inches of silver white, bound at one end by the remnants of the ceremony braid. She stood holding it for one breath. Then she turned and looked at Darius fully. His face had finally found an expression. It was not the one she would have predicted a year ago. There was something in it that moved too fast to read. Shock. And beneath the shock, something else. Something that in a different life she might have described as the beginning of understanding. Too late for that. She walked to him. 2 steps. Close enough that she could have whispered and he would have heard every word. Instead, she let her voice carry, not loud, not theatrical, but clear and level across a hall that had gone so quiet she could hear the candles burning. "You didn't take my name from me," she said. "I'm giving it back." She dropped the silver hair at his feet. The thornwood handle of the blade she placed on the dais rail between them. Her wolf thorn crown she set beside it. 3 objects, 14 years. The hall did not breathe. "From this moment on," Celine said, "you no longer have a Luna." The words fell into the silence and did not echo so much as simply sit there, the way heavy things do when they are set down and will not be moved. "And this kingdom," she said, "no longer has my protection." Something shifted in the air. She could feel it. Could feel it the way pack blood always felt pressure changes, the way wolves went still before a storm broke. Not metaphor. Actual atmospheric shift, something that moved through the hall like the first cold edge of a wind coming from a direction no one had been watching. Not everyone understood what she meant. She could see that in the hall. The guests who were reading this as public drama, marital spectacle, a proud woman making a scene at a banquet. They saw the hair, the blade, the words, and filed them under humiliation and reaction. Some of the older faces understood. Elder Harkon understood. She could see it in his eyes from 20 feet away. The sudden sharpening, the recalculation happening in real time as he assembled facts he'd been keeping separately and found that they arranged into a shape he hadn't been expecting. The elder councilwoman who had watched her from across the head table understood. 2 of the Eastern River Clan delegates understood, though they could not have explained exactly what they understood or why the knowing of it made the air in the room feel suddenly colder. Darius looked at her. The amber eyes, the jaw, the face of a man encountering something that did not fit inside his current model of the world. "Celine," he said. And for once the name was neither acknowledgement nor warning. It was something rawer than that, something that might have mattered once. She looked at him for one breath. Then she stepped off the dais. The crowd parted. Not because she commanded it. She gave no signal, made no gesture. They simply moved. 200 people between her and the hall doors, and they moved aside as she walked through them, and she looked at none of their faces because looking would have required her to perform something for them, and she was done performing. The doors of the Grand Moonfire Hall opened, and she walked through them and they closed behind her. The corridor outside was empty and lit by low wall torches and smelled like stone and cold air coming from the open sky courtyard at the far end. She walked. Not running. She would not run. Running was panic, and she was not panicking. She was the most precisely not panicking she had ever been in her life, which meant the thing underneath the not panicking was enormous, but it was hers and she would carry it at whatever pace she chose. She walked the length of the corridor, turned left toward the servants' passage that connected the main hall to the residential wing, because the servants' passages were faster and empty, and she did not want fast or empty right now, for the reason that fast and empty meant arriving somewhere, and arriving somewhere meant stopping, and stopping meant the thing underneath the not panicking would have room. She stopped in the servants' passage anyway. Halfway through, in the narrow space between the kitchen supply shelves and the back wall, with the noise of the great hall muffled to a distant murmur and the torchlight thin and orange and low. She pressed her back against the wall, raised one hand, touched the back of her neck where the hair was cut short and blunt now, the ends uneven because she had done it with one motion in a moment that did not allow for precision. The air on her neck was cold. She had not felt the air on her neck in 17 years. She stood there in the narrow passage and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she had learned to manage it. The thing that lived in the chest, The thing that was not quite grief, and not quite fury, and not quite relief, but occupied the territory where all three states bordered each other. She had 4 horses she could trust. 3 people in this palace whose first loyalty was to her rather than the crown. One property that was entirely hers, not the crowns, not the Thorn dynasties, not held in her name as Luna, but registered under her family name, Ashcroft, from before the bonding. A 3-week ride northeast in the foothills above the Silverstem Valley. Small, defensible. Hers. She had known for some time, she thought. She had known, and she had stayed because leaving was an acknowledgement that the thing was real, and as long as she was still here doing the work, the thing could remain a suspicion rather than a fact. He had made it a fact. In front of Elder Alpha Harkin and the Eastern River clans and 300 pack witnesses and every council seat, he had made it a fact, and the specificity of the public setting. Not an accident, she understood that now with a clarity that felt like cold water. The specificity of doing it at the Moonfire banquet, at the oath renewal, at the single ceremony most saturated with the symbolic weight of the Luna's role, told her something about the nature of the decision. It had not been thoughtless. Darius Thorn was many things she had revised her opinion of over 14 years, but he was not stupid about power. He had chosen this setting because he had calculated that she would absorb it, that she would stand at his right hand with her face arranged into professional stillness and hold the counter phrases ready and let the ceremony proceed and absorb the public redefinition of her position because that was what she always did. He had been wrong. She pushed off the wall, straightened, touched the back of her neck one more time, the short blunt ends of her hair, cold in the passage air, and let her hand drop. There was work to do. A different kind than she was used to. A kind that did not involve anyone else's kingdom. She began to walk again toward the residential wing, toward the 3 rooms she had maintained as her own for 14 years that she would need to clear by morning, toward the 3 people she trusted and the horses she could take, and the property in the Silverstem foothills that was already, legally, in ways he had never thought to examine closely enough, hers. Behind her, muffled through 3 walls and 2 stone corridors, the grand Moonfire Hall had begun to make noise again. The specific noise of a large gathering recalibrating itself around something that had just happened in its center. She had attended enough councils and courts and assemblies to know the different textures of crowd noise. She could have parsed that sound even through 3 walls and told you the rough shape of what was being said and to whom and with what degree of alarm. She did not parse it. She walked. She was halfway down the residential corridor, close enough to her own rooms to see the light she had left burning in the outer chamber window when she heard the running footsteps behind her. Not Darius. Darius did not run. She turned. It was Marin, her second handmaid, 17 years old from the Pinefold Pack territory in the far south, whom Celine had brought to the palace 3 years ago and trained personally in the specific skills required to work in proximity to power without being consumed by it. Marin was breathing hard, her face flushed, her eyes carrying the kind of information that eyes carry when the body arrives somewhere before the words have organized themselves into sequence. "My Luna," Marin said, and stopped, looked at Celine's hair, looked at her neck. Something moved across the girl's face, a brief, unguarded thing, there and gone. And Celine recognized it because she had learned to read every face in this palace. It was not pity. It was something harder than pity and more useful. The specific expression of someone whose loyalty has just been confirmed as correctly placed. "Tell me," Celine said. Marin swallowed. "Elder Alpha Harkon refused to give his oath, my Luna. After you left. He stood in front of the dais and he looked at the king and he said..." She stopped, collected herself. "He said he gives his oath to the Luna's protection or to no crown at all, and then he left the hall." Celine looked at her. "And then," Marin said, "the Eastern River clans left with him." The torchlight in this corridor held very still. Somewhere in the lower levels of the palace, a door slammed. The heavy oak sound of a great hall's service entrance. Not the decorative doors, but the real ones. The ones used by people actually leaving rather than making exits. "Who else?" Celine said. Marin's jaw tightened. "The 2 northern border alphas. 3 of the outer territory pack representatives. And..." She paused on the last item in a way that told Celine the last item was the worst one. Elder Councilman Veyrath. He stood up from the council table and walked out without speaking. Veyrath had been on the Elder Council for 31 years. He had served Darius's father. He did not leave rooms. He was the kind of man whom other men watched to know whether a situation was serious, because in 31 years he had never once judged a situation to be serious enough to leave. Until tonight. Celine stood in the corridor with the cold air on the back of her neck and felt something that was not quite satisfaction, because satisfaction was too small and too simple for what this was. It was more like the feeling of watching a thing you have long known to be structurally unsound finally make the sound that confirms your assessment. Not pleasure. Recognition. She had told him. She had told him in the 2 minutes she asked for before the ceremony began. She had told him in the language she always used with him. Clear, practical, without dramatics, without the performance of emotion, in the professional voice that he had trained himself to hear as the voice of management rather than the voice of a person. That the seating of Elder Harkin mattered. That the next 2 hours mattered. That how the crown presented itself tonight would determine whether the border alliance held through the next year or began its quiet disintegration. He had said later. He had said, "Enjoy the evening, Luna." He had turned to Vivian and called her onto the dais. "Is the king," Celine started, "still in the hall, my Luna, with Lady Vivian, and whoever didn't leave?" Marin's voice was flat with the specific flatness of someone keeping strong feeling carefully away from their words. The ceremony stopped. He hasn't restarted it. The Moonfire Oath Renewal, 200 years of unbroken tradition, the single ceremony on which the legal validity of the Crown's Protection Compact rested for another 5-year cycle. Stopped. The oaths unspoken would expire at dawn. By pack law, a crown that failed to receive the renewal oaths before first light had no legal basis for demanding border warriors and territory taxes and military commitments from the outer packs until a new ceremony could be convened. Convening a new ceremony required 30 days formal notice to all pack representatives. 30 days during which the kingdom's entire defensive architecture operated on custom and good faith rather than legal obligation. Darius knew this. He had to know this. He had sat through 3 previous Moonfire renewals, and she had briefed him before everyone, the same briefing, because some information had to be repeated annually or did not stay in the places where decisions were made. She wondered in the cold corridor, with the sound of departing footsteps still audible through the stone, how much of what she had briefed him on over 14 years had actually been retained versus how much had been filtered out as background noise. The sound of the Luna managing things, which could be safely ignored because the Luna was always managing things, which was the same cognitive error as believing food will always appear because it always has. She turned back toward her rooms. "Marin, my Luna. Wake Councilwoman Aldeth and ask her to meet me in the map room in 20 minutes. Don't use the main corridors. Use the supply passage off the east kitchen." "Yes, my Luna." "And Marin," she stopped, her back still to the girl. "Don't call me that anymore." A pause. "What should I call you?" Celine thought about it. The question was more complicated than it appeared. Luna was a title conferred by bonding and confirmed by ceremony. She had severed the bonding marker tonight. She was technically in a legal gray zone that pack law had not been required to define in several generations because nobody had done what she had done on a Moonfire night in front of a hall full of witnesses. And the law, like most laws written by men, had not anticipated the scenario in which the Luna was the one who decided she was done. "Celine," she said. "Just Celine." She heard Marin's footsteps move away down the corridor, quick and certain. The girl had a gift for purposeful movement. Celine had noticed it early and cultivated it because purposeful movement was one of the few things that could not be faked under pressure, and she had spent 3 years testing Marin's composure in increasingly difficult situations to confirm that what she was seeing was real rather than performed. She had spent 3 years, she thought, building an exit she had told herself she wasn't building. Some part of her had known. She reached the door of her outer chamber and put her hand on the iron ring and pulled it open and went inside. The room was exactly as she had left it. The desk with the 3 sealed correspondence packets that needed to go out with tomorrow's rider, the wall map of the kingdom's eastern territories with the drought relief distribution mark she had made last week, the small fire burning low in the hearth because she kept it low to save fuel. and she had been keeping it low for 3 years since the Eastern Province harvest failures began cutting into the general treasury. She stood in the middle of the room. She had 20 minutes before Councilwoman Aldith arrived, assuming Marin moved quickly, which she would. In 20 minutes, she needed to have decided several things. What she said to Aldith, how much of what she intended to do she disclosed in this first conversation, whether this room, which she had occupied for 14 years, and which contained every document and correspondence thread and territorial map that constituted the institutional memory of the kingdom's administrative functioning, was a room she would leave tonight or a room she would leave tomorrow. What she picked up and what she left behind. She went to the desk and opened the lower left drawer. Beneath 3 layers of correspondence files, old petitions, resolved disputes, closed trade agreements, was a leather document folder that had been there since the 3rd year of her tenure at the palace. She lifted it out. Inside were 2 documents, a property deed in her name as Celine Ashcroft, transferring the Silverstem Foothills estate from her father's estate to her own personal holdings, witnessed and stamped. And a second document, shorter, a letter she had written to herself 8 years ago and had never sent to anyone because it had never been meant for anyone. 7 paragraphs, in her handwriting, describing in precise and unsentimental terms exactly what she would do if the thing that had happened tonight ever happened. She looked at the letter, at her own handwriting from 8 years ago, the careful, controlled hand of a woman who had already, at 31, learned to plan for contingencies that she prayed would never be necessary. She had written, "If this day comes, do not hesitate. You already know what comes next. The hesitation is not doubt, it is grief. Let them exist separately. Grief for the life you built, certainty about the life you choose." She folded the letter, put it in the pocket of her silver ceremonial gown. Outside in the corridor, she heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast. Not the running footsteps of Marin bringing Aldith, too heavy, too many, and coming from the wrong direction. Coming from the direction of the Grand Moonfire Hall. She closed the leather folder, set it on top of the desk, put both hands flat on the desk surface, and stood still, listening, reading the footsteps the way she read everything. Pace, weight, direction, the space between each sound that told you whether the person making them was in control of their own movement or being driven by something behind them. 3 men, heavy-booted, moving with purpose rather than urgency, which meant they had been sent rather than panicked. Royal guard boots made a specific sound on the stone corridors of this palace because they were fitted with iron heel plates that Celine had ordered 8 years ago when she noticed the old leather sole boots wore unevenly on the wet season floors and created a tripping hazard on the east staircase. She had ordered the iron heel plates. Of course she had. She had ordered everything in this palace that mattered. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A knock. Not the knock of a request. The knock of a formality preceding an action that had already been decided. Celine straightened, turned to face the door. "Come in," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. She had always had steady voice. It was one of the things she had never needed to practice because it had come standard with whatever she was made of. The stillness that sat underneath every storm she had ever stood inside and held the center while the edges flew apart. The door opened. Captain Aldrich of the Royal Palace Guard was a man she had known for 11 years, a competent man, a man whose fundamental decency she had always respected, which was why she had advocated for his promotion to captain 8 years ago over 2 other candidates with better noble connections and worse judgment. He stood in her doorway now with 2 of his guard behind him, and his face wearing the expression of a man doing something that he had been ordered to do and had decided to do cleanly rather than with additional complications. "My Luna," he said. She looked at him. "By order of Alpha King Darius Thorne," Aldrich said, in the flat recitative voice of a man delivering words that are not his, "you are ordered to remain in your chambers tonight and to submit to a breath." The smallest hesitation, which was the only personal commentary she would get from him. "To submit to a formal review of your status and conduct before the Elder Council, to be convened at His Majesty's discretion." Celine looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at Celine. Between them, in the air, was 11 years of her knowing exactly who he was, and him knowing exactly who she was, and the full weight of the Moonfire Hall and what had happened in it, and what the iron heel plates on his boots meant about who had actually been managing the functioning of this palace. "He's locking me in," she said. It was not a question. Aldrich did not treat it like one. "I have my orders, my Luna." Behind her, through the thin wall that separated her outer chamber from the building's exterior, she heard the distant sound of hooves on the palace courtyard. Not one horse, not two. Many. The sound of a delegation departing in the night. Harkon, the eastern clans, the border alphas, gone. And here in her room were three men in iron-heeled boots and a king's order, and the beginning of something that she had not fully named yet even to herself. The beginning of Darius' understanding, too late and too small, and with instruments far too blunt for the actual problem, that the thing he had done tonight could not be contained by locking it in a room. Celine looked at the room around her. The desk, the maps, the low fire, everything she had built inside these walls. Then she looked at Aldrich, and she made sure he saw exactly what was in her face. Not the professional stillness, not the managed composure, but the actual thing underneath it. The full and complete knowledge of what she was and what she had built and what it was going to cost this kingdom to have chosen tonight's particular wrong. "All right, Captain," she said quietly. She sat down in the chair behind her desk with perfect composure and folded her hands on top of the leather document folder. "Lock the door." Aldrich did not move for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, his face showed her something. Brief, involuntary, the crack in a disciplined man's surface where the actual person lives. Then he turned, gave a short order to one of the guards behind him, and the door closed. The bolt slid home. Celine sat in the locked room with the low fire and the territorial maps, and her hands folded on top of the document folder, and she heard through the wall and the window and the 3 corridors between her and the Moonfire Hall the sound of what she had spent 14 years holding together beginning, slowly and irrevocably, to come apart. She was not afraid. She had been planning for this for 8 years. What she had not planned for, what she sat in the locked room discovering in real time, was that somewhere in the East Wing, in rooms that Celine had passed every single day for 3 years and had never once entered, Lady Vivian Crest was already giving instructions to someone in a low, urgent voice. Instructions that were not about celebrations. Instructions that were about documents. Specific documents. In a tone too careful for someone improvising, in a language of request that had the shape of something rehearsed. And the name she was giving to the person she was speaking to was not a servant's name, and not a guard's name, but the name of a man who sat on the Elder Council, and who had not, Celine realized with a cold that went all the way to her spine, been among the councilmen she had watched leave the Moonfire Hall tonight. He had stayed. The voice was low, deliberate. The kind of low that was not proximity but intention. A person who had learned that certain conversations carried more weight when they could not be traced to a specific volume. Celine sat at her desk with her hands folded on the leather document folder and listened through the wall. She could not make out every word. The East Wing partition was old stone, 2 feet thick, designed in an era when palace architecture was built for defense rather than comfort, and it absorbed sound the way deep water absorbed light, selectively, leaving only the shapes of things rather than the things themselves. She caught syllables, fragments, the rhythm of someone speaking in structured segments, the way you spoke when you were delivering information you had organized in advance. The name she had caught, Councilman Orveth, sat in her mind and turned itself over. Orveth had been on the Elder Council for 9 years. He was 63 years old, from the Ashpine Coastal Territory, appointed during the administrative restructuring that Celine herself had designed in the 5th year of her tenure to balance the council's geographic representation. She had advocated for his appointment. She had argued his merits to Darius for 2 separate audiences, citing his trading expertise and his neutral standing on 3 contested territorial disputes. She had built his seat. She breathed through her nose, even, measured. The fire in the hearth had burned down to deep orange coals. She did not move to add wood. She sat in the cooling room and listened to the shape of the conversation on the other side of the wall, and ran her mind back through 9 years of Orveth. Every council session, every closed-door review, every piece of correspondence that had crossed her desk with his signature on it, looking for the thing she had not seen because she had not been looking for it. It was always there when you went back. She had learned that over 14 years of managing a kingdom's invisible architecture. The telling detail was never hidden carefully. It was hidden in plain sight, in the space where you were not looking because you had already categorized the person as a known quantity. Orveth had voted against the Eastern Drought Relief allocation last winter. She had noted it at the time as a fiscal conservatism position. The man had always been careful with treasury expenditure, which was one of the reasons she had wanted him on the council. She had outvoted him and moved the relief forward and filed the disagreement as resolved. She filed too many things as resolved. The voice on the other side of the wall stopped. Silence. Then a door opened and closed, and the footsteps that moved away were lighter than Orveth's, the second person, leaving. And then nothing. Just the cooling room and the coals and her own breath. She looked at the locked door of her chamber. Aldrich had locked it from the outside. Iron bolt, standard palace fitting, the same locks on every residential chamber because she had standardized the hardware 11 years ago for inventory management. She knew the spec of every lock in this building. She had signed the purchase order. She rose from the desk without hurrying, crossed to the window. It was not barred. The residential wing windows had no bars because the residential wing was inside the palace's primary defensive perimeter, and the threat model for these rooms had never included a Luna trying to leave. That oversight had been in the original architecture, not something she had introduced. She had simply never corrected it. She looked down. 20 feet to the inner courtyard garden. The thornbloom centerpiece arrangements she had commissioned were still visible in the torchlight below. White flowers in the dark, already beginning to close their petals against the cold of the late night. The garden was empty. The guard rotation for the inner courtyard changed at the third bell, which was 30 minutes away. She had 30 minutes. She went back to the desk, opened the lower left drawer, and pulled out the leather document folder. Inside it, beneath the property deed and the letter she had written to herself 8 years ago, was a third document she had not looked at in 2 years. A handwritten accounting of every significant piece of institutional knowledge she carried that existed nowhere in the palace's formal records. Names, relationships, the informal agreements that underpin the formal ones, the specific pressure points and vulnerabilities of every major pack alliance. 14 years of knowledge that lived in her head, and because she had been careful, also on these 8 pages in her own hand. She folded all 3 documents and put them inside the front of her dress against her skin. She pulled a traveling cloak from the wardrobe, plain wool, dark gray, not a Luna's garment. She kept it for the dawn ride she had taken alone in the early years, before the security protocols she herself had implemented made solo rides impractical. She looked around the room one more time, the wall map with its drought relief marks, the correspondence packets on the desk waiting for tomorrow's rider. The low fire. 14 years in this room, every surface carrying the residue of work that would never be attributed to anyone specific because that was the nature of the kind of work she had done. It disappeared into the outcome and left no record of who had made the outcome possible. She left it all where it was. She was at the window, one hand on the frame calculating the drop, when the bolt on her door slid back. She did not move from the window. She turned slowly, one hand still on the frame, and looked. It was not Aldrich. Councilwoman Aldith stood in the doorway in a traveling cloak considerably less plain than Celine's, with Marin visible in the corridor behind her, and the expression of a woman who had assessed a situation very quickly and made several decisions in sequence without wasting time on uncertainty. "I didn't come through the main corridors," Aldith said, dry and brisk, the voice she used in council sessions when everyone else was taking too long to reach an obvious conclusion. "And I didn't use the supply passage either, because that passage has been watched since the second hour of the evening." She stepped inside and pushed the door partially closed behind her, looked at Celine at the window, at the traveling cloak, at the absence of the wolf thorn crown and the silver ceremonial hair. "I see you're already past the part where you consider staying." "Orveth," Celine said. Aldith's face changed. "Not much, say." The woman had 40 years of council service and had learned to keep her face the way Celine kept her voice. "But enough. You heard something. Through the wall, his name, the shape of a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. How long?" Not a question about the conversation's duration, a question about how long Aldith had known, and they both understood that. Aldith came further into the room. She moved like a woman who had decided not to waste words on preamble. "I have had a suspicion for 4 months, evidence for 6 weeks. I did not bring it to the king because—" She stopped, started again differently. I brought it to the king 3 weeks ago. I was told the matter was being reviewed at his discretion. The fire crackled once in the hearth. Celine looked at the older woman and understood several things at once. Darius had known, or had been told, and had chosen his discretion over action, which meant he had either not believed it, or had believed it and weighed it against something else and found the something else heavier. "What does Orvith want?" Celine said. "What they always want." Aldith's voice was flat. "The kind of access that's only possible when the person who has been blocking it is no longer blocking it. The trade routes. The Ironmere Compact, specifically. Your renegotiation last season closed 3 loopholes that had been generating significant private income for a small number of people who should not have had private income from Kingdom trade routes." Celine thought about the Ironmere Compact renegotiation. 8 months of correspondence, 2 face-to-face delegations, 1 near breakdown of talks that she had salvaged at 2 in the morning by writing an alternative clause that gave both sides enough face-saving language to step back from the edge. She had closed those loopholes deliberately because she had tracked the income irregularities for 2 years and knew exactly where the money was going. She had not known it was going somewhere Orvith could reach. "Vivian," she said. Not a question either. Aldith sat down in the chair across from the desk. Lady Vivian Crest's father defaulted on a substantial private loan 18 months ago. The creditor, through 2 intermediary holding arrangements, connects to a trading consortium that Orvith has been quietly directing since his Ashpine days. A pause. "When you renegotiated the Ironmere Compact and closed the loopholes, you disrupted the income stream that was servicing that loan arrangement." Celine sat down, not at the desk, in the chair beside the hearth, in the diminishing heat of the dying fire, and let the full shape of the thing assemble itself in her mind. It had not been simply Darius's vanity. Darius's vanity had been the instrument, not the hand holding it. Vivian had been placed, positioned, cultivated over the specific period required to become indispensable to a king's attention, and the king, who was not stupid about power but was, she knew this about him, genuinely blind to the kind of long-term strategic patience that motivated people who had been quietly losing money, had not seen it because he had not been looking for it. He had been looking at a beautiful woman who wanted nothing from him except to be near him, which was the most effective disguise that category of motive had ever found. And she had been the obstacle, not just as Luna, specifically as the person who had renegotiated the Ironmere Compact. "How long has Orvith been working with Vivian's people?" she said. "I believe the arrangement predates Vivian's arrival at court by approximately 8 months. 8 months before Vivian arrived at court. Celine ran the timeline backward. That put the arrangements beginning right at the start of the Ironmere renegotiation, when she had first made clear to the trade delegations that the existing loopholes would not survive the new terms. They had planned around her. Before she had even finished the work that threatened them, they had identified her as the threat and begun building the mechanism to remove her." She breathed, in through the nose, the cold air, sharper now as the fire died. "What does Orvith want tonight specifically?" she said. The conversation through the wall. Aldith looked at her with the directness of a woman who had decided that the moment for diplomatic cushioning had passed. "There is a document, a set of documents more accurately, correspondence that, if read without context, suggests that your renegotiation of the Ironmere Compact involved personal financial considerations on your part." The room held very still. "Manufactured," Celine said. "Manufactured, but well made. I have seen one page. Orvith left it on the council table 3 weeks ago, and I believe it was deliberate to see if I would react." Aldith's jaw tightened. "The signature is very good. I have sat across from you in council sessions for 9 years, and I had to look at it 3 times before I was certain it was not yours." 9 years. Aldith had been looking at her handwriting for 9 years, and it had taken 3 careful examinations to tell the difference. Someone had been studying her handwriting for long enough to replicate it closely enough to fool a woman who had 9 years of comparative reference. Celine thought about the locked door, the order to submit to a formal review, Darius's voice tonight saying later, enjoy the evening. And now she understood the geometry of it. He had known a review was coming. He had been told a review was coming. He had been told there was evidence, and whatever shape that evidence had been presented in, It had been sufficient to move him from skeptical to contingently believing, which was all the manufactured document needed to do. Not convince him completely, just convince him enough to hold her here while the paperwork assembled itself into a case. He had locked her in the room, not out of cruelty, out of uncertainty, which was, in some ways, worse. Cruelty was simple. Uncertainty meant he had looked at the evidence someone had carefully built to destroy her and had not immediately known it was false, had not immediately said this is not her, had chosen the review over the certainty. 14 years. Aldith, she said. Her voice was the professional voice, even and level, because the thing underneath it was too large and too cold for any other register. What I'm about to tell you is not a request for your help. It is information you can use as you choose. The councilwoman looked at her. I'm leaving tonight, before the third bell. She watched Aldith's face. It did not move. What happens in this palace after I leave is going to happen with or without me, and it is going to happen faster than Orveth, and whoever is behind him has planned for, because what they built their plan around. My continued presence here managing the consequences of every bad decision is no longer a variable they can count on. They know that, Aldith said quietly. That's why the documents exist. They need you discredited before you can speak from the outside. Then they'll need to move fast. They will move fast. So will I. Aldith was quiet for a moment. The dying fire. The cold room. Outside, somewhere in the lower palace, a door opened and a voice said something sharp and short and closed again. The Greymere dispute, Aldith said. The two northern border alphas. Celine looked at her. They left the hall tonight, but they did not leave the capital. Aldith reached into the front of her cloak and produced a folded piece of paper. She set it on the arm of Celine's chair. Elder Alpha Voss of the North Pine Pack is staying at the Stone Road Inn, 2 miles east of the palace gate. He asked me 3 days ago for a private meeting with you that I did not arrange because I did not want to arrange anything through palace channels until I understood the situation more fully. Celine looked at the folded paper. Voss. North Pine Pack. She had been trying to get Voss to the table on the Greymere dispute for 2 years. He was old-style Northern Alpha. He did not negotiate through intermediaries. He did not accept written proposals. He sat across a table from the person he was dealing with, and he decided in that session whether he trusted them or he didn't. She had requested 4 direct meetings. Darius had declined each time on scheduling grounds. She picked up the paper. I cannot tell you to go there, Aldith said. I am an elder councilwoman and you are... Your status tonight is legally ambiguous, which means anything I direct you toward makes me party to whatever follows. I know. I can tell you that the Stone Road Inn is outside palace jurisdiction, and that Elder Alpha Voss has 23 border warriors with him, and that a man who rode 3 days to request a private meeting with the Luna and was publicly humiliated at the Moonfire banquet tonight is a man whose mood and whose calculations are likely to be... She chose the word carefully. Receptive. Celine folded the paper and put it with the documents against her skin. She stood up. She looked at Aldith, at the carefully composed face of a woman who had come to an unlocked door that she had been told to lock and had found a reason not to lock it and would not explain why to anyone who asked, and who was sitting in this room providing information that she was providing in an entirely personal capacity with no official implication. 9 years, Celine said. 9 years, Aldith agreed. Not warmly. The woman was not built for warmth in the way some people weren't built for patience. It was simply a material she did not work in. But she held Celine's gaze with the steady, direct attention of someone who had made her assessment a long time ago and was not currently revising it. Celine went to the window. Marin, she said without raising her voice. The girl appeared in the doorway. She had been standing in the corridor this whole time, Celine realized, listening, keeping watch. The East Stable. Corin and the Grey. 2 horses Celine had trained herself, registered under her household management accounts rather than the royal stable inventory because she had approved the registry paperwork personally and had been, apparently, already building exits before she consciously admitted she was building exits. Quietly. Already done, Marin said. Celine looked at her. I started moving when I heard the bolt slide home, the girl said, without apology or drama. I didn't know how long you'd need. I wanted them ready. 17 years old. Celine had recruited her from the Pinefold pack at 14 because she had seen something in the girl's eyes during a territory inspection that she recognized. The particular alert stillness of a person who missed nothing and said little and had been underestimated so consistently that they had learned to carry that underestimation like a second skin and see everything from inside it. Come with me, Celine said. Myron did not hesitate, did not look back at the corridor, did not ask about wages or the implications for her position, or whether this was a decision she should consider further. She simply stepped away from the doorway and moved to Celine's side. Celine looked at Aldith one final time. The Ironmere Compact documents, she said. The 3 amended clauses I filed in the treaty archive. Get copies to Elder Alpha Harkon before the manufactured correspondence surfaces. He'll know what they mean. Yes, Aldith said simply. Celine put her hands on the window frame and looked down at the inner garden 20 feet below. The white thornbloom flowers closed against the cold, and she did not feel the height. Because she had never been afraid of heights, she was afraid of the specific kind of falling that didn't announce itself until you were already in the air and there was nothing to catch you because you had believed until the last moment that the ground was solid. She had felt that fall tonight. She had survived it. She went over the windowsill and dropped into the dark below, and the garden caught her cleanly, and she was already moving toward the east stable before the thornbloom petals had finished trembling. Behind her, in the room she had occupied for 14 years, Councilwoman Aldith sat in the chair beside a dead fire and did not move for a very long time, thinking, in the careful private way of a woman who had served 3 kings and 2 regents and had learned the difference between the ones who built things and the ones who spent them. Thinking about what it meant for a kingdom when the person who had been quietly holding it together decided, with complete composure and a traveling cloak and 2 pre-positioned horses, that she was done. Outside the palace walls, in the cold dark of the Capitol Road, 2 horses moved east at a fast walk that Celine did not push to a gallop, because a gallop created sound, and she did not need speed right now. She needed distance and silence, and she had been managing with less than she needed for 14 years without showing it, and this was no different. And the cold air on the back of her neck where the hair was cut short was not absent, she decided. It was just air, just the temperature of the night against her skin, and she had lived through worse than cold. The Stone Road Inn was lit. 2 miles east on the trade road, a low stone building with a stable yard and a fire in the common room window that bled orange light into the dark. She pulled her horse to a stop 20 yards out. Marin stopped beside her without being asked. There were 12 horses in the stable yard. She counted them from where she sat. 12 horses, which was more than the standard guard detail for a single alpha, which meant Voss had not come to the capital alone and had not sent the extra men back after the Moonfire Hall emptied, which meant he had been waiting for something and had not known whether what he was waiting for would come to him or whether he would have to go to it. She sat on the horse in the cold dark and looked at the lit window and felt the shape of the next hour settle into her bones. She had come here with 2 horses and a 17-year-old girl and the clothes on her back and 8 pages of institutional knowledge pressed against her skin, and she was going to walk into that inn and sit across a table from a northern alpha who had been waiting 2 years for a meeting that the king had denied him, and she was going to offer him something the king could not, which was the truth about what this kingdom was and who had actually been building it, and whether he wanted to be part of what came next. She did not know what he would say. She had never been certain about Voss. He was the kind of man you could not pre-read from documentation. The words on paper said conservative, territorial, grudge-holding, potentially immovable. What the paper could not tell you was whether those qualities were the product of character or circumstance, and circumstance could change if what you offered was real. She kneed her horse forward. They were 20 feet from the inn's door when it opened from the inside. Elder Alpha Voss of the North Pine Pack was a broad man, gray-haired, with the weathered face of someone who had spent 30 years making hard decisions in bad weather and had not particularly enjoyed any of them. He stood in the lit doorway and looked at her, at her traveling cloak, at her short-cut silver hair, at the absence of every marker of the position she had held 3 hours ago, and something moved in his face. Not surprise. He was too old for surprise at this hour. He stepped aside, held the door open. "Figured you'd come tonight or not at all," he said. "Wasn't sure which." Celine dismounted. handed her reins to Marin without looking away from Voss. "Were you betting on which?" Something shifted in the weathered face. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. "My second said you'd come. My captain said a woman who just cut her hair in front of the whole kingdom was either going to disappear into the hills or set the hills on fire." She walked to the door, stopped in front of him, close enough that she could see the amber torchlight reflecting in his eyes, and he could see hers. "Tell your captain," she said, "that those aren't mutually exclusive." Voss looked at her for 3 full seconds. The measuring look of a man who had been lied to often enough to have developed a specific and reliable instrument for detecting it, and who was currently running that instrument and getting a reading he had not expected. He stepped back and led her inside. And in the warm common room of the Stone Road Inn, with 12 North Pine warriors watching from the corners and the fire burning high and the night outside cold and permanent, Celine Ashcroft sat down across the table from the man who commanded the longest and most contested border in the kingdom. And the world she was building began. What neither of them knew, in that warm room with the fire and the beginning of something, was that back in the palace the manufactured documents had already been placed. Not on the council table, not in the review chamber, in the king's own hand. Someone had put them where Darius would find them when he returned from the hall, alone, to the chambers that no longer had a Luna in them, had placed them on his desk beneath a single candle left burning, so that the first thing he saw when he opened the door was his own wife's handwriting, or what looked exactly like it, betraying him in ink. And the king, alone for the first time in 14 years in rooms that suddenly felt very large and very cold, had picked them up, and had started to read. The fire in the Stone Road Inn common room burned without apology. Voss sat across from Celine with his thick forearms on the table and his hands wrapped around a cup he had not drunk from since she started talking. And he had the specific quality of stillness that came from a man who had learned, over a long life of hard rooms and harder decisions, that the most dangerous thing you could do when someone was giving you real information was interrupt it. She had been talking for 20 minutes, not performing, not negotiating in the careful circling way that formal alliance discussions required, where every concession had to be wrapped in language that made it look like a gift rather than a necessity. She was talking the way she had talked to herself in locked rooms at 2 in the morning with a quill and a lantern and the full weight of the kingdom's fragility pressing against the back of her skull, directly, without decoration, with the specific precision of someone who had spent 14 years watching what happened when the truth was managed instead of spoken. She told him about the Ironmere loopholes, about Orvith and the trading consortium, and the 18-month loan default that had made Vivian Crest useful to people who needed the Luna removed. She told him about the manufactured documents and where they had been placed and what they were designed to do. She told him about the Greymere dispute and the 4 meeting requests and why they had been refused and what the refusal had actually cost in border stability over 2 years. She told him things that a Luna speaking officially would have wrapped in diplomatic framework until the meaning was so cushioned it couldn't bruise anything. And she told them plain because she had walked out of the palace tonight with nothing left to protect except the truth of what she knew. Voss did not move through any of it. When she stopped, the fire cracked once. One of the North Pine warriors in the corner shifted his weight. Marin sat against the far wall with her hands in her lap and her eyes moving between Celine and Voss in the measured way of someone keeping count of something. Voss looked at his cup, drank from it, set it down. "The Greymere territory," he said. "The counter-survey you proposed 2 years ago, the one that never got formally submitted. I have the draft." His eyes came up. "Where?" She touched the front of her cloak briefly. "Here." Something crossed his face. Not admiration exactly. The man was not built for admiration any more than Aldith was built for warmth, but a recalibration, the specific look of a person revising an estimate upward. "You plan to leave?" he said. "I plan for the possibility." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Planning for a possibility means you hope you're wrong." She held his gaze. "I hoped I was wrong for approximately 4 years. The room was quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the stable yard. The fire settled lower. "What do you want from me?" Voss said. "Nothing tonight." She let that land before she continued. "Tonight, I want you to know what you know. What happened in that hall. What the documents say and what they're for. I want you to carry that knowledge north when you ride. and I want you to carry it as a man who sat across a table from me in a roadside inn at midnight and decided for himself what the truth was. And later depends on what happens in the palace between now and when the border packs get the official version of tonight's events. She kept her voice even. The official version is going to say something specific about me. I want you to already know the other version before the official one arrives. Voss was quiet for a long moment. He turned the cup in his hands. Once, twice. My captain's assessment, he said finally. The hill's on fire. Tell your captain he can start measuring the smoke. She rode out of the Stone Road Inn yard before the third bell with Marin at her side and 23 North Pine border warriors who had been given no orders to stop her and did not. She rode east on the trade road with the manufactured documents against her skin and Elder Alpha Voss's nod. Not a commitment, not an oath, just a nod. But a nod from Voss of North Pine was the kind of currency that other men spent their careers trying to earn. And she did not look back at the Capitol's lights because looking back was a habit she was in the process of removing from herself the way you removed a splinter, deliberately, with full knowledge of the pain, because the alternative was infection. She was 6 miles east of the Capitol when Marin said, without preamble, "Someone's behind us." Celine did not turn. How far? Half a mile? Maybe less? Moving fast but not running, trying to close without sounding like they're closing. One rider. Celine had heard it 2 minutes ago and had been deciding what it meant. One rider was not an arrest detail. An arrest detail was 4 men minimum, probably 8 given the circumstances, moving with the authority of explicit orders. One rider was a message, or a man acting outside his orders, or both. She pulled her horse to a stop and turned. The rider came out of the dark at a controlled canter and slowed to a walk as he got close, and she recognized the iron heel plates on the boots before she recognized the face. Aldrich, captain of the Royal Palace Guard, alone, in a plain riding cloak that was not his uniform. He stopped his horse 10 feet from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The road was dark and cold and empty in both directions. "Captain," she said. "I'm off duty," he said, which was the most technically specific lie she had heard in a long time, and she respected it. "Then what brings you out on the trade road at this hour?" Aldrich reached inside his cloak. He produced a sealed document tube, the kind used for formal correspondence that needed to survive bad weather, and held it out across the space between their horses. She took it, broke the seal, unrolled the document inside. It was short, 8 lines. In Darius's handwriting, which she knew as well as her own, had read thousands of times, had watched form and evolve over 14 years from the aggressive scrawl of a young alpha king who wrote like he was making a point into the slightly more controlled hand of a man who had learned, slowly, that documents had consequences. She read it once, then again. Her face did not change. The document was a formal accusation, specific, structured, citing the manufactured correspondence as supporting evidence, misconduct, misappropriation of treaty negotiation authority, breach of fiduciary duty to the Crown, 8 lines that, taken together, constituted a legal basis for stripping her of every formal status she retained and opening a criminal review before the full Elder Council. A criminal review. Not an administrative one. Criminal. She rolled the document and put it in her cloak pocket. "He signed it himself," she said. Not a question. 2 hours ago. Aldrich's voice was flat, the flatness of a man who had decided to deliver this information because not delivering it was a worse choice, and who was not going to perform emotion about that decision. Did he read it first? Also not a question. Aldrich was quiet for exactly long enough. "He read it," he said. "He read it, and he called for the council recorder, and he signed it." Celine looked at the dark road ahead of her, at the eastern horizon where there was no light yet because dawn was still 2 hours away. She thought about Darius in his chambers, alone, with the manufactured documents on his desk and the candle that someone had left burning so he would find them. And she thought about the specific kind of man who, when presented with evidence of betrayal by someone he had already chosen to distrust, found it easier to believe the evidence than to set it aside and ask harder questions about who had placed it and why and what they wanted. He was not a stupid man. She needed to hold that truth carefully right now, not let herself revise it downward in the direction that would make this easier to survive. He was not stupid. He was a man who had been carefully positioned to receive a prepared story at a moment of maximum vulnerability, on a night when he had publicly humiliated his Luna and was alone for the first time in a long time in rooms that suddenly didn't have her in them. And the story was well made, and the signature on it was very good, and he had read it and signed the accusation because signing it felt like action, and action felt like control. And control was the thing that had been draining out of the room all night. She understood the mechanism. Understanding it did not change what it had produced. Aldrich, she looked at him directly. Why are you here? The captain looked back at her. The specific look of a man deciding, in real time, how much of himself to put in an answer. My wife is from the eastern provinces, he said. Harlan territory. Drought hit her family's farm 18 months ago. The relief allocation that got pushed through last winter, he stopped. I know who pushed it through. The fire relief allocation. 8 months of Celine arguing the case before a council that was evenly split, Orveth leading the opposition on fiscal grounds, Celine going around the formal process and directly to 3-pack elders who held proxy votes until she had enough to force the approval. She had not slept for 3 days during that push. She had eaten 1 meal a day and drunk too much cold tea and had run the numbers 6 different ways trying to find an allocation model that would satisfy the fiscal conservatives while still getting enough grain to the eastern farms to prevent starvation. She had not known, in any of that grinding work, that one of the names on the beneficiary list belonged to the family of the man who was now sitting on a horse in the dark, handing her documents he had not been sent to deliver. Go back, she said. Don't do anything that puts you on the wrong side of the review. I've been thinking about wrong sides, Aldrich said. Your family needs you employed and alive. Go back. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the capital without another word, and she watched him go until the dark took him, and then she turned east and rode. She did not speak for an hour. Marin did not speak either. They rode together in the cold dark with the eastern provinces gradually flattening around them and the capital's lights fading behind them, and Celine carried the criminal accusation in her pocket and the 8 pages of institutional knowledge against her skin and the weight of a signature that had been written 2 hours ago in a hand she knew as well as her own. She had known the document was possible. She had known, in the abstract planning way of someone building contingencies in a drawer, that if the manufactured correspondence surfaced before she had enough distance and enough alliances, the accusation could follow. She had known it. What she had not prepared for, what no amount of midnight contingency planning could fully prepare you for, was the specific texture of receiving the news that a man you had built 14 years of your life around had read fabricated evidence of your betrayal and had chosen to believe it without asking you a single question. Not a message to her chambers. Not a summons to answer the accusation before signing it, not even a moment of the doubt that she would have extended to him without hesitation, that she had extended to him dozens of times when smaller accusations from smaller people had targeted her over the years and she had believed, chosen her over them. He had signed it. She let herself feel that for exactly as long as she could afford to feel it, which was the length of 3 miles of dark road and the cold air on her neck and the sound of 2 horses on packed earth. Then she put it where she put the other things she could not act on, not away exactly, nothing was ever entirely away, but to the side, in the peripheral space where it could exist without obstructing the center. The center needed to be clear, because what she understood now, with the criminal document in her pocket and 6 miles between her and the palace, was that the contingency had become the plan, not the fallback, the actual plan. She was not a Luna in temporary exile waiting for the situation to clarify. She was a woman who had been formally accused, whose formal status had been stripped, who was riding through the eastern darkness with a 17-year-old girl and 8 pages of paper and the beginning of an alliance that was not yet an alliance, and what she needed to build from these materials was not a defense. It was a replacement. She arrived at the Silverstem Foothills property on the morning of the 3rd day. The estate was smaller than the palace stables, a stone farmhouse, 2 outbuildings, 40 acres of high pasture that backed against the ridge. She had not been here in 4 years. The caretaker, an old man named Fetch, who had worked her family's land since before she was born, and who owed his loyalty to the Ashcroft name rather than the Thorn Crown, met her in the yard with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit for longer than she had been planning it. "The house is ready," he said. Been keeping it ready. She looked at him. Your father told me, he said. Before he died, he said, keep it ready. He didn't say what for. He didn't need to. Her father, who had watched her ride away to the Thorn Palace at 17 with the wolf thorn crown on her head and had said nothing at the gate except be smarter than they expect, who had transferred this property into her name within the year, quietly, through channels that did not connect obviously to the palace, who had died 6 years ago in this house, in the east-facing room, and who she had not been able to get back to in time because the border negotiation that week could not be paused, and she had convinced herself there would be another chance, and there had not been. She walked inside. The house smelled like cold stone and old wood and the dried herbs that Fetch's wife hung in the kitchen every autumn. Small rooms, low ceilings, the desk in the front room where her father had worked his land accounts, the chair by the window where he had read on winter mornings. Nothing of the palace in this place. Nothing of the 14 years she had spent turning herself into the specific instrument that a certain kind of kingdom needed. Just stone and wood, and the smell of a life that had been lived without performance. She sat down at her father's desk. She placed the criminal accusation on the wood in front of her. She placed the property deed beside it. She placed the 8 pages of institutional knowledge beside that. She placed the folded paper from Aldeth, Voss's name, the stone wrote in, beside all of it. She looked at what she had. What she had was not enough. She knew that with the clarity that tended to arrive in cold rooms after 3 days of hard writing, the clarity that had no patience for optimism or its opposite. She had the beginning of a northern alliance that was not yet an alliance. She had institutional knowledge that was valuable only if she had allies positioned to use it. She had a property that was hers, and a caretaker who was loyal, and a 17-year-old girl who had followed her without hesitation, and whose loyalty she had not earned through position but through something more durable and more difficult than position. What she did not have: a formal standing from which to speak, an official channel through which to present the evidence of Orveth's manufactured documents, a mechanism to reach Harkon and the eastern clans and the border alphas who had left the hall before the full picture had been drawn for them. What she also did not have: Aldeth. She had been expecting a message from Aldeth by the second day, a writer from the capital with a sealed tube, the way Aldrich had come with the accusation. Nothing had come. The absence of a message from Aldith was a data point that she turned over carefully and did not like. On the morning of the 4th day it came, not a sealed tube. Marin brought it from the gate, a single folded page, no seal, delivered by a girl she didn't recognize who had ridden from the capital alone and said only that Councilwoman Aldith had asked her to bring it. Celine unfolded it. 3 lines in Aldith's careful hand. Orveth has moved the review timeline forward. The full council has been convened for 3 days hence. I will be present. I cannot delay it. Below that, a single additional line that had been added in a different pressure, like an afterthought that was not an afterthought at all. They have Marin's name on the accusation as a co-conspirator. Celine set the paper down on the desk. She sat very still. Marin was in the kitchen with Fetch's wife. She could hear the sounds of it. Water, the scrape of a pot, the low exchange of 2 people in proximity to a task. 17 years old, from the Pinefold pack. 3 years in the palace, recruited and trained by Celine, her name now on a criminal accusation in a capital 3 days' ride away. Because she had saddled 2 horses. Because she had been smart and loyal, and had looked at a locked door and decided at 17 to already have the horses ready because that was what the situation required, and she was the person in the position to do it. Celine pressed the heels of her hands against the desk surface and felt the cold wood and breathed. The thing that moved through her in that moment was not grief and not fury. It was colder than both and more precise. The temperature of a decision being made at depth rather than surface. The kind of deciding that happened below the level where emotion operated and could not be undone by it. She had been willing, she understood now, to let herself be accused, to carry the accusation and build her defense and fight it from the outside on her own timetable. She had been willing to absorb that. She was not willing to absorb this. A 17-year-old girl who had saddled 2 horses. She picked up the quill from Fetch's desk. Found paper. Wrote 4 names. 4 people in 4 different territories who owed her specific, documented favors that she had never called in. Favors significant enough that calling them now would not be a request, but a reminder of an outstanding debt. She wrote each name with the coordinates of how to reach them. She folded the paper. She walked into the kitchen. Marin looked up from the pot she was tending, read Celine's face the way she had always read it, with the specific attentive accuracy of someone who had learned to watch for the difference between the professional stillness and what lived underneath it. "My name's on it," Marin said. Not a question. The girl had known it was coming, Celine realized, had been waiting for it with the same peripheral calculation that Celine herself used, holding it at the side of her vision, not looking directly at it until the looking became necessary. "Yes," Celine said. Marin turned back to the pot, stirred it once, the sound of the wooden spoon against the iron. Then she set the spoon down and turned and leaned her back against the kitchen wall and looked at Celine with steady dark eyes. "What do we do?" she said. Celine looked at her, at the girl she had recruited and trained and brought into the proximity of danger without fully accounting for what that proximity would cost when the danger arrived. "We stop playing defense," Celine said. She held out the folded paper with the 4 names on it. "I need you to ride," she said. "Not back to the capital, north. The first name on that list is 3 days' ride into North Pine Territory. You give him that paper and you tell him—" She stopped, chose the next words with care, because they were the words that would define the shape of everything that followed. "Tell him the Luna who held the kingdom together is calling in what she's owed, and she's not asking for favors. She's offering a seat at the table when the current table is replaced." Marin took the paper, did not look at it, kept looking at Celine. "What table?" she said. Celine thought about the kingdom assembly that the outline of this situation was building toward, the convergence point where all the threads would arrive at once, where Orveth's manufactured accusation and Vivian's installed position and Darius's signed document and the departed border alphas and the broken Moonfire oaths would all be in the same room together, and the room would have to decide what was true. She had been, her whole career, the person who prepared for the room, who mapped the seating and vetted the correspondence and negotiated the pre-agreements that made the room's outcome possible before the room ever convened. She had done it in service of a king who had just signed her name to a criminal accusation. She was going to do it one more time, for herself. "The only table that matters," she said, "the one where I get to decide who sits at it." Marin looked at her for one long moment, at her short silver hair and her traveling cloak and her father's kitchen and the 4 names on the paper. And then she pocketed the paper and pushed off the wall and said, "I'll leave within the hour." Outside, the wind was moving through the Silverstem foothills with the cold specific insistence of a season that had decided to arrive early, and in the capital, 3 days away, a council review was counting down to a verdict on a woman who was no longer in a room waiting to be judged. And somewhere on the road between those 2 points, the shape of the next part of this story was already in motion, running parallel to the official version, moving in the quiet spaces between the announcements and the formal proceedings and the documents with signatures on them. The kind of motion that didn't look like anything from the outside, until it did. The Kingdom Assembly convened on the coldest morning of the season. Celine had known the date 3 days before the official summons went out, because Aldith had sent a second rider. Not a message this time, just a date scratched on a scrap of leather in a hand that could have belonged to anyone, and the date matched exactly what she had calculated from the review timeline. Orveth had pushed the council session to coincide with the assembly, which was either arrogance or efficiency, and probably both. The assembly brought every major pack representative to the capital in one convening. Whatever verdict the council produced would be witnessed immediately by every power in the kingdom, with no interval for the information to be contested or softened in transit. It was a good play. She had to acknowledge that. Fast, clean, total. Produce the accusation, produce the verdict, present it to the assembled kingdom as settled fact before the other version of events had time to organize itself into a credible counter-narrative. It would have worked against most people. She had spent 14 years in rooms where plays like this were made. She had spent 11 of those years quietly making sure the king she served was never on the receiving end of one. She knew the mechanism from the inside. She rode into the capital on the morning of the assembly with 6 people at her back, not warriors. She had no warriors. Not officially, not yet. Voss's commitment was conditional, and the 4 names on her list had produced responses that ranged from firm to cautious, and none of them had been asked to ride armed to the capital, because armed riders arriving with a formally accused woman would have handed Orvith exactly the image he needed to complete the story he was telling. She rode in with Marin and 5 others, 1 Elder Pack representative from the Northern Territory, 2 trading consortium auditors whose existence Orvith did not know she knew about, Aldith's private legal recorder, and a man named Soren, who had been the kingdom's chief treaty archivist for 22 years, and who owed Celine a favor so significant and so specific that she had never written it down anywhere because some debts were safer held in memory than in paper. 6 people. Against the full council, the manufactured documents, a king's signed accusation, and Vivian Cress' 3 months of installed influence. She rode in through the east gate at the second bell, and she did not wear the silver ceremonial gown. She wore riding clothes, dark and plain, and her silver hair was short and uncovered, and the cold morning air moved through it freely. She had no crown, she had no title, she had no formal standing in the proceedings she was about to walk into. She had the truth, which was a weapon that cut in both directions and required nerve to hold. The Kingdom Assembly Hall was the largest room in the Capitol complex, larger than the Moonfire Banquet Hall, built in an earlier century for the specific purpose of hosting the full convening of pack representatives when the kingdom needed to speak with one voice. It held 400 seats arranged in a horseshoe around a central floor, with the crown's dais at the open end and the elder council table to the right of it. When she arrived at the outer corridor, the hall was already filling, pack representatives and their retinues moving through the wide doors with the specific controlled noise of powerful people in a formal setting, the noise of performance and positioning, and the careful management of who was seen speaking to whom before the proceedings began. Celine did not go through the main doors. She went through the service corridor that ran behind the council table's position, the one used by recorders and support staff, the one she had walked 100 times in 14 years and whose dimensions and door placement she knew without needing to look. Soren was with her. Aldith's legal recorder was with her. The 2 trading consortium auditors were with her. The others she had positioned already. The Northern Pack representative had entered through the main doors 20 minutes ago and was seated in the assembly floor with instructions. Marin was in the upper gallery with a sight line to the council table. She reached the service door behind the council table and stopped. On the other side of that door was the room, the accusation, the verdict that had been scheduled before she arrived. And Darius, she had not let herself think about Darius in the 3 days of riding, had held him in the peripheral space with the other things that could not be acted on in motion. Darius, who had signed his name to a document that called her a criminal and was about to sit on the dais of the Kingdom Assembly and let that document be read aloud to every pack in the kingdom. She pressed her palm flat against the door, the man she had built 14 years beside, the king she had held up in the specific invisible way that invisible work held things up, from below, from the foundation, in the cold hours before anyone else was watching. She had not done it for gratitude. She had not done it for acknowledgement. She had done it because the kingdom was real, and the people in it were real, and the gap between what the crown could manage without her and what it managed with her was the gap between stability and the slow grinding collapse of everything that kept ordinary people from starving. She had done it because it mattered, and she was the one who could. And he had read 8 lines on a piece of paper and signed his name. She understood, in the precise, unsentimental way that she understood most things, that the signing did not mean he believed she had done it. It meant he had been afraid. Fear in a man who had built his identity around fearlessness was the most dangerous thing she had ever managed, and she had been managing it in him for years without naming it. And the night of the Moonfire Banquet, the public humiliation, the departure of the Border Alphas, the broken ceremony, the rooms suddenly empty of the person who had always been in them, had produced fear on a scale that the manufactured documents were specifically designed to catch. Give a frightened man a story that explains why everything went wrong. Give him a name to put on the collapse. He will sign the document because signing it means the collapse has a cause that is not him, and a man can survive a cause that is not him. She pushed the door open and walked in. The council table was not yet full. 3 elder council members were in their seats. 2 more were entering from the main floor side. At the far end of the table, with his back to her entrance and his head bent over a document portfolio, was Orvith. He heard the door, turned. His face did the thing that faces did when they encountered something that had not been included in the plan. A rapid sequence of micro-expressions too fast to fully catalog, surprise and calculation, and the specific tightening around the eyes of a man who was deciding in real time how threatened he was. She crossed the space between the door and the table without hurrying. Soren was behind her. She placed both hands flat on the table surface across from Orveth and looked at him. "Councilman," she said. His face had settled into the composed professional mask she knew from 9 years of council sessions. "The former Luna has no standing in these proceedings," he said. His voice was steady, the voice of a man who had prepared for this possibility and had decided the prepared position was sufficient. "I'm not here in any official capacity," she said. "I'm here as a citizen of this kingdom with documentation relevant to the review." She reached into her cloak and placed the 8 pages of institutional knowledge on the table, not as a weapon yet, as a statement of presence. "I'm here as the woman who renegotiated the Ironmere Compact and closed the loopholes that were generating private income for a trading consortium you have been directing since your Ashpine appointment." The 2 consortium auditors came through the service door behind her and placed their own documents on the table. Soren placed the Treaty Archive certification beside them. Orveth looked at the documents. He looked at Soren. Recognition, recalculation, the brief involuntary assessment of a man counting what he was facing. "These proceedings are formal council business," he said. "You cannot, I can present evidence to a formal council review," Celine said. "That is a right held by any citizen with material information." "I have material information. I'm presenting it." She looked at him steadily. "If you'd like to object to my presence, object on the record. Today's session is a kingdom assembly. Everything said in this hall goes into the formal record. Object on the record, Councilman." Orveth did not object on the record. The hall filled over the next 40 minutes. She stood at the back of the council table area and watched it fill the way she had watched rooms fill for 14 years, reading the geometry of it, who moved toward whom and who avoided whom, and where the uncertainty lived in men's bodies when they were in a room where they did not yet know what was going to happen. The Border Pack representatives were there. Harkon of Black Ridge was in the 3rd row of the assembly floor, and when his eyes found her across the hall, they held on her face for a long moment, and then moved to the council table, and then came back to her face with the specific expression of a man recalibrating his mourning. The Eastern River Clan delegates were there. They should not have been. They had left the capital the night of the Moonfire banquet, and a return in 3 days was a hard ride. Someone had asked them back. She did not know who. She filed it. The Northern Pack representative she had ridden in with was in his seat. Vivienne Crest was in a chair to the right of the crown's dais, dressed in a deep crimson again, the color of deliberate statement. Her face was composed with the specific composure of a woman who had been told the proceedings were already decided, and who was present primarily as a display of the decided outcome. Darius came in last. He came through the main doors with his guard at his back and took the dais with the physical authority of a man who had been doing it since he was 22. The particular way he occupied space, the charge of the air around him, the fact of his physical presence that had never ceased to be what it was regardless of what she thought about the person inside it. He was pale. She noticed that. Beneath the composure of the performance, beneath the Alpha King surface that he wore as naturally as his own skin, he was pale in the way of a man who had not slept. He had not slept. She stood at the back of the council area and looked at him on the dais and felt something she did not have precise vocabulary for. Not love and not grief exactly, but the specific texture of knowing someone completely, all the way down to the pale face under the performance and the sleeplessness under the pale, and having that knowledge be both the most intimate thing she possessed and the thing that was absolutely not sufficient reason to stop what she was about to do. She knew him. It had not protected her. It would not protect her now. Orveth called the session to order. The formal reading of the accusation took 8 minutes. She stood and listened to her name read aloud in the compound sentence of a formal criminal charge: misconduct, misappropriation, breach of duty. And she listened to the 8 fabricated lines presented as documentary evidence, and she watched the hall listen to them, watched 400 PAC representatives and elder council members and foreign delegates process the words. And she counted the faces that believed it, and the faces that were uncertain, and the faces that were already looking at her rather than at Orveth, which was more faces than she had calculated. When Orveth finished, the hall was quiet. Darius was looking at the dais surface in front of him, not at her, the sleeping pale jaw, the amber eyes directed downward. "The accused has no standing to respond," Orveth said. The council will move to deliberation. The accused, Celine said, loud enough to carry, has the right of address before deliberation under Article 9 of the Kingdom Assembly Charter. She was already walking toward the center floor. The charter your review is being conducted under, Section 3, Paragraph 2. Any individual subject to a formal criminal review before the Assembly has the right to address the full body before deliberation begins. She said it without checking the document because she did not need to check it. She had written Article 9 of the Kingdom Assembly Charter during the administrative restructuring of the 5th year of her tenure. She had written Section 3, Paragraph 2 specifically because there had been a previous abuse of the review mechanism 17 years earlier, before her time, and she had read the record of it and had thought this should not be possible and had made sure it would not be possible again. She had written her own right of address. 9 years ago, for a reason she could not have named at the time. Orveth looked at her. His face was tight. He was running the charter text in his memory, and he was finding, she could see him finding it, that she was correct. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "I won't need 5, she said. She stood in the center floor of the Kingdom Assembly Hall with 400 people looking at her, and she did not feel the weight of the looking the way she had felt it at 17, terrified and determined not to show it. She felt it differently now. Felt it as what it was, which was the attention of people who had not yet decided what they believed, which was the only kind of attention worth having. She did not perform. She said, "The Ironmere Compact renegotiation closed 3 income loopholes. Those loopholes were generating approximately $40,000 in annual private income routed through 2 intermediary holding arrangements to a trading consortium directed by Elder Councilman Orveth." She let that land. One breath. That income was also servicing a private loan default by Lord Cressfall, Lady Vivian's father, which means the person currently sitting to the right of this kingdom's crown was placed there specifically to facilitate the removal of the person who closed those loopholes. The hall made a sound. Not loud. The specific sound of 400 people absorbing a sentence simultaneously. "The documents submitted as evidence against me are fabricated," she said. "I have here the original treaty archive certification for every Ironmere clause, signed, dated, and counter-certified by the kingdom's chief archivist." She held out the documents, and Soren stepped forward to carry them to the council table. "I have here independent audit confirmation from 2 former consortium members of the income routing I just described." The auditor stepped forward. "And I have here—" She paused. Not for drama, because the next item required precision. "A sworn testimony from Elder Councilman Vyrath, who left this hall 3 weeks ago when he was shown the manufactured correspondence and refused to continue, and who has provided a written account of exactly how and by whom those documents were presented to this council." She placed Vyrath's testimony on the table herself. She had received it by rider the previous morning. She had not known he would provide it. She had sent him a message through Aldeth's channels and had given him the choice and had not expected him to take it, and he had taken it, and she did not know if that was courage or the specific exhaustion of a 31-year council member who had finally encountered a line he would not cross. It did not matter which. What mattered was the document. Orveth was on his feet. "This is procedurally irregular. These materials have not been vetted by—" "By who?" Celine said. "By the council member who manufactured the evidence they're being presented against." She looked at him across the table. "You can challenge every document I've placed in front of this hall. That challenge will be on the record, under your name. In the Kingdom Assembly formal record that goes to every pack in this kingdom within 30 days. She let him look at her. "Challenge them, councilman." Orveth did not challenge them. The hall was very loud now and then very quiet as Darius stood up on the dais. He stood, and the hall responded the way it always responded to him standing. The instinctive silence of a room in the presence of an apex authority, the biological fact of it, unchanged by everything else that was also true. He stood, and he looked out at the hall, and he did not look at Vivian, and he did not look at Orveth, and he looked finally at Celine. She looked back. This was the thing she had been building toward and avoiding simultaneously. The direct line of sight across the full hall in front of every witness the kingdom contained, nothing managed between them. No professional voice, no peripheral placement, just the full unmediated fact of what they were to each other and what had been done. His face, from this distance, was unreadable. She was close enough to see the amber eyes, and far enough that the micro-expressions were lost. She had spent 14 years reading his face from close range. She did not know how to read it from here. He opened his mouth. What happened next did not come from the dais. It came from the main doors. They opened with the specific violence of doors opened by people who are not interested in ceremony, and the 12 men who came through them were wearing North Pine Pack colors, gray and black, the Wolf Ridge emblem on the chest. And they were armed with the controlled, purposeful armament of warriors who had been told to be present and visible rather than to act. And behind them, walking through the doors with the unhurried authority of a man who had made a decision and was done reconsidering it, was Elder Alpha Voss of the North Pine Pack. He had ridden 3 days. He walked to the center floor, stopped 6 feet from Celine and looked at the dais. At Darius. At Orveth, at the council table. At Vivian in her crimson chair. He took the full geometry of the room in one slow look the way old alphas did, the look that was itself a kind of statement, the look that said, I see everything in this room, and I have already decided what I think of it. Then he looked at the assembly floor, at every pack representative seated in the horseshoe. North Pine renews no oath, he said, to a crown that cannot tell the difference between a traitor and the woman who built everything worth protecting. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a man who had commanded 23 years of northern border defense and who the assembly floor knew. I came to this capital to give my oath to a Luna. That Luna is standing in the center of this floor in riding clothes with no title and more evidence in her hands than this council has produced in 3 weeks. My pack's oath goes to her or it goes nowhere. The hall erupted. Not chaos, organized eruption. The kind that happened when a thing that many people had been thinking suddenly had a voice. And the voice was Voss of North Pine, who did not say things he did not mean. And the eruption was the sound of 400 people processing simultaneously what it meant for the longest-serving Border Alpha in the kingdom to walk into the kingdom assembly armed and speak those words on the record. Harkon of Black Ridge was on his feet. The Eastern Clan delegates were on their feet. In the upper gallery, Marin was very still with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the center floor. Darius had not moved on the dais. He stood and looked at Celine across the hall, and the noise crashed around both of them, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do in years, something that had no performance in it, the face underneath the face, the pale, sleepless man beneath the Alpha King's surface. And she looked at him, and she did not look away. She had told him, she thought. She had told him in the 2 minutes she asked for before the ceremony. She had told him in 100 professional briefings and 1,000 corridor conversations, and in the specific language of 14 years of work done side by side in the cold hours before anyone else was watching. She had told him in every way available to her except the one that required him to already understand what she was telling him, which was the only way that had ever mattered. He understood it now. She could see that. She could also see with the precision that came from knowing him completely, that understanding it now was not the same as it being in time. Orveth moved, not toward the center floor. He moved away from the council table toward the side corridor, the same service passage she had entered through, the one that connected to the palace administrative wing. He moved with the controlled, unhurried motion of a man who had prepared an exit, the way you prepared any contingency, because a man who had operated at his level for 9 years always prepared an exit. Celine tracked him with her eyes. Voss's second warrior moved before she did, was already angling to intercept before Orveth reached the corridor door because Voss had positioned his men with the specific foresight of a border commander who had been reading the room since he walked in and had already calculated the exit points. Orveth stopped. He was 20 feet from the corridor door and 8 feet from the North Pine warrior, and he turned and looked back at the hall, at the assembled kingdom, at the evidence on the council table, and the documentation in Soren's hands, and the 12 armed men in gray and black, and his face showed the specific expression of a man arriving at the end of a plan that had failed in the particular way that well-constructed plans failed. Not all at once, but sequentially, each contingency closing as you reached for it until there were no more contingencies left, and what remained was the unmediated fact of what you had done. Vivienne was standing. She had been standing since Voss walked in, very still in her crimson dress. And Celine looked at her now directly for the second time. This time not in the firelight of the Moonfire banquet, but in the full cold light of the assembly hall in front of every power in the kingdom, and Vivian looked back with the eyes of a woman who had understood, approximately 30 seconds after Orveth began laying documents on the council table, that the plan she had been placed here to serve had just come apart in a public forum, and that the distance between where she was standing and where she would be standing by the end of this morning was enormous and could not be closed by beauty or position or any of the instruments she had been given. The hall was still very loud. Darius stepped off the dais. He stepped down the 3 dais stairs and walked onto the center floor, and the hall noise dropped, not to silence, to the specific lower register of 400 people still talking, but doing it quietly because the king was walking. And when the king walked in a hall like this, you watched the direction. He walked toward Celine. She stood still. He stopped 6 feet from her, the same distance Voss had taken. She thought that was probably not intentional, and also that it was the right distance. The distance of 2 people who needed to speak honestly without the false proximity of a closeness that had not yet been earned back. He looked at her. This amber eyes, the sleepless face, the jaw with the tell that was present now, the muscle beneath the ear, tight with the specific tension of a man doing something he did not want to do and could not refuse. He was not performing. She recognized the absence of performance in him the way she recognized it in herself. The specific quality of a face that has run out of a reason to manage its own expression. The documents, he said. His voice was low, for her, though the hall's reduced noise meant half the front rows could hear him anyway. I read them and He stopped. Started differently. I should have come to you. She looked at him. I should have come to you before I signed anything, he said. I should have come to you before I called the review. I should have... The jaw tightened. There are a significant number of things I should have done that I did not do. Yes, she said. He looked at her face, her short silver hair, the riding clothes, the absence of everything that had marked her position for 14 years. She watched him look at it and watched him understand fully what the looking meant. That the woman in front of him was not the Luna who had managed his kingdom from the position he had given her. She was the woman who had been building something without his knowledge or involvement for years, who had walked out of a locked room and ridden 3 days and walked into his assembly hall with enough evidence and enough alliances to publicly dismantle a conspiracy that had been operating inside his council for 9 months without him noticing. He had not noticed. She had. She had noticed, and she had renegotiated the Ironmere Compact, and she had closed the loopholes, and she had kept the border alliances and the relief allocations and the oaths and the seating arrangements, and she had done all of it while he sat at the head table looking at Vivian, and he had not noticed because he had been relying on the ground to be solid and had never looked down to see who was standing in it holding it up. I need to ask you something, he said. The hall was listening, all of it. 400 people and 12 North Pine warriors and Voss and Harkon and the Eastern clans and Orveth frozen by the corridor door and Vivian in her crimson dress and Aldith at the council table and Marin in the gallery and the formal record that would go to every pack in the kingdom within 30 days. Darius looked at Celine in front of all of it, and before he could ask what he needed to ask, before the question that everything in the last 4 days had been building toward could be spoken in this hall, on this record, in front of these witnesses, the corridor door behind Orveth opened from the outside. Not the North Pine warrior, not a council staff member. The man who came through the door was tall, in a plain riding coat, with the look of someone who had been traveling for several days and had not stopped to change his clothes and had not cared. He was 40 years old. He had a scar along his left jaw that Celine recognized because she had been present when he received it, which was a long time ago in a different life, and his name was Lord Commander Edron Ashcroft, her brother, who had been in the eastern frontier provinces for 3 years at the assignment she had negotiated for him before the Moonfire banquet, who she had not sent a message to, who she had not told to come. He looked at her from across the hall with the specific expression of an older brother who has ridden several days without stopping and has arrived to find a situation that is simultaneously worse and more resolved than he expected. And he looked at Darius beside her on the center floor. And he looked at Orveth pinned at the corridor door, and his jaw did the thing that their father's jaw had done when their father was deciding something. He reached into his riding coat. He produced a document. He walked it across the hall to the council table himself and placed it on the surface with a sound that was quiet and absolute. Eastern Frontier testimony, he said, to the council, to the hall, to the record. from 12 provincial administrators, documenting the specific allocation decisions, the specific author of those decisions, and the specific impact on Eastern Province survival rates over the last 18 months. He stepped back, signed, witnessed, dated. He looked at Celine. She looked at him. "Took me a while to get here," he said. "You got here," she said. He walked to her side and stood there with the scar on his jaw and the writing dust on his coat. And the hall was very still now in a way it had not been still before. A different quality of stillness, the stillness of a room that had been watching a single person stand against a prepared case with nothing but truth and nerve, and had just watched that single person stop being alone. Darius was still 6 feet away. He looked at Celine, at her brother, at the documents on the council table, and Orvith at the door in the hall behind him that had come here to witness a verdict and was in the process of witnessing a completely different thing. He opened his mouth, and Celine looked at him, at the man she had known for 14 years, sleepless and pale and standing in the middle of the thing his choices had built. And she said, before he could speak, in the level professional voice that was also and always had been the truest voice she owned, "Don't ask me in this hall, Darius." His mouth closed. "Whatever you're about to ask," she said, "it deserves an answer you can hear. This hall is not where you'll hear it." He looked at her for a long moment. The amber eyes, the full weight of the morning, the signed document, the manufactured evidence, the empty rooms, the 14 years, all of it sitting in the air between them in front of 400 witnesses. Then he nodded. Once. Small. The tell beneath his ear was gone. Celine turned to the council table, to Aldith, who was watching her with the steady directness of 9 years. "The review," Celine said, "the documentary evidence. I want it on the record that the accused requests full deliberation. Every document, every testimony, everything submitted this morning, to be read into the formal record before the council returns its determination." "Agreed," Aldith said, before anyone else could speak. Celine looked at Orveth at the door. He looked back at her with the face of a man who had come to the end of his contingencies, and she looked at him with the face of a woman who had prepared for this morning for 3 days and for this possibility for 8 years, and who was not, now that it had arrived, particularly interested in how he felt about it. "Sit down, councilman," she said. He sat down, and in the Kingdom Assembly Hall, with the formal record running and every pack representative in the kingdom present and the documents on the table, and Voss of North Pine standing with his 12 warriors and her brother beside her with dust on his coat, Celine Ashcroft stood in the center floor and waited for the truth she had carried here to be read aloud in the place where it could not be unmade. What none of them knew yet, not Voss, not Aldith, not her brother, not Darius on the center floor, was that Vivian Crest had not spent the last 4 days waiting, and the document she had been preparing was not about the Ironmere Compact. It was about the Ashcroft name, about what it had been 20 years ago, before Celine's father had transferred the Silverstem estate and paid a debt that had never been recorded in any public account, and whose terms, if they came to light now, in this hall, on this record, would change the shape of everything that Celine had just built. Vivian reached into the front of her crimson dress and smiled. Vivian's hand came out of the crimson dress, holding a document sealed with wax, the color of dried blood. She did not move toward the council table. She moved toward the center floor, toward the space where Celine and Darius stood 6 feet apart, with 14 years of wreckage between them, and she moved with the specific confidence of a woman who believed she was still holding something. The hall that had been lowering toward resolution went taut again. 400 people recalibrated simultaneously. The way a room recalibrated when the thing it thought was finished showed a new face. Celine looked at the document. She looked at the wax seal, a house crest she recognized, though it took her a half-second longer than she would have liked because the crest was old and she had only seen it twice in her life. The Ashcroft family's creditor seal. Her father's generation. The seal of a debt she had known existed in the abstract way that children knew their parents carried weights they did not name, and which she had never examined directly because her father had never invited examination, and she had respected that boundary the way she respected most things he asked of her without asking. She felt her brother go still beside her, not the stillness of a man who did not know what the seal meant, The stillness of a man who did. 22 years ago, Vivian said, to the hall, to the record, to every face turned toward her. The Ashcroft family estate was carrying a debt of sufficient magnitude that its default would have resulted in the dissolution of the Ashcroft territorial holdings and the formal disgrace of the Ashcroft name before the Pack Council. Her voice was composed, prepared, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was not improvising. That debt was quietly settled through a private arrangement brokered by the Crestfall Trading House, my grandfather's house. The terms of settlement included a binding covenant prohibiting any Ashcroft family member from pursuing legal or administrative action against Crestfall financial interests for a period of 30 years. She looked directly at Celine. That period does not expire for 8 more years. Every action taken in this hall today, the Ironmere Compact renegotiation, the testimony submitted, the evidence presented, constitutes a breach of a legally binding covenant. Under Pack Covenant law, a breach of this magnitude voids all actions taken in breach and subjects the breaching party to the full original debt terms. The hall did not make a sound. Celine stood in the silence and looked at Vivian and thought about her father, the east-facing room where he had died, the property deed transferred into her name within a year of her marriage. Be smarter than they expect, at the gate, watching her ride away. The careful, invisible architecture of a man who had known something was coming and had prepared for it in the specific way that men prepared when they could not stop the thing but could cushion its landing. She thought about the 8 pages against her skin, the property deed, the letter she had written to herself at 31. All the exits built before she was ready to admit she was building exits. She thought about her father's voice, which she had not heard in 6 years. Then she put him back in the peripheral space and looked at Vivian with completely clear eyes and said, "Show me the covenant." Vivian extended the document. Celine took it, broke the seal, unrolled it, read it. Not quickly, not performing composure while skimming, but actually reading. The way she read everything that mattered, which was slowly and completely and with the specific attention that allowed her to find the thing hiding in the language that the person who wrote the language hoped you would not find. She read the covenant twice. Then she looked up. "Soren," she said. The treaty archivist came forward from his position at the council table. She handed him the document. He read the relevant section she indicated with her thumb, his eyes moving carefully through it, and she watched his face and saw the moment he found the same thing she had found, the slight, involuntary stillness of a man who had spent 22 years working with legal documents and recognized when one had been imprecisely constructed. "The covenant names Celine Cara Ashcroft," Soren said, to the hall, without inflection, reading directly from the document. "By full legal name as required for binding covenant construction under Pack law." He set the document on the council table. The Luna assumed the name Celine Thorne upon bonding. Under Article 14 of the Kingdom Bonding Charter, a bonded Luna's legal name is her bonded name for the duration of the bonding. The covenant's named party, Celine Cara Ashcroft, ceased to exist as a legal entity the day she bonded to the Thorne House. He looked at the hall. The covenant binds a legal name that has not existed for 14 years. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then it broke, not in Vivian's favor. The sound that went through the hall was the specific sound of a prepared case collapsing under its own weight in a public forum, the sound of people who had been holding their breath releasing it in the direction of the collapse. Celine had heard that sound before. She had never heard it directed at something built against her, and the difference was significant and physical. She felt it in the base of her sternum, a loosening, the specific release of a held thing. Vivian was very still. She was looking at the covenant on the council table, and her face was doing the rapid internal accounting of a woman who had been given a weapon by someone who had not told her it was flawed, and who was now standing in the open with it having failed, in front of 400 witnesses and the formal record, with nowhere to go that was not already visible. Celine looked at her. She had thought, in the days before this morning, that she would feel something specifically sharp when the moment arrived, the moment of Vivian's position crumbling, the specific satisfaction of a counter. She had been careful not to plan for the feeling because planning for the feeling of winning was the kind of preparation that made you brittle when the win arrived differently than imagined. She had been right to be careful because what she felt now was not sharp and not specifically satisfying. It was quieter than that. The particular quiet of a thing being set down after you have carried it for a long time. Vivian looked up from the covenant and looked at Darius. He had not moved from the center floor. He was looking at Vivian with the expression of a man who was in the process of understanding something he had been refusing to understand for a significant period of time. The way you understood a thing when the last piece arrived and the picture was suddenly complete and could not be made incomplete again. The amber eyes were very still. The jaw was set. The tell beneath his ear was gone. "You knew," he said. His voice was quiet. For her, Celine realized, the same way his earlier words had been for her, a low register that carried regardless. "You knew about the covenant being flawed." Vivian looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. It was a single word, and it was a lie. And everyone in the hall who was paying attention knew it was a lie, and Darius knew it was a lie. And the knowing of it moved through his face like something breaking open at depth, slow and total, and producing a change in the surface that would not be undone. He turned away from her. He turned back to the center floor, to the 6 feet of space between himself and Celine, and he stood there with his jaw set and his eyes very still, and all the performance gone from his face, and he was just a man standing in the wreckage of his own choices, and it was one of the most nakedly human things Celine had ever seen him be. "Orveth," Celine said. She did not look at Darius. She looked at the council table, at the North Pine warrior still positioned at the corridor door, at Orveth seated in the chair she had told him to sit in. "Stand up," she said. He stood. He had the bearing of a man who had decided that if the situation was beyond recovery, the only remaining instrument was dignity, and he was going to use it. "You have 2 choices," she said. "You can give the council a full accounting of the trading consortium, the income routing, the Crestfall loan arrangement, and the manufactured correspondence. Everything. On the record. Now." She looked at him without heat. She was not angry at him in the way that required heat. She was clear about him, which was a different state and a colder one. "Or you can decline to provide it, and I will present the audit documentation and the consortium testimony and Veyrath's account, and you will provide it anyway, except you will provide it as a man who made the council extract it, rather than as a man who chose to speak first." Orveth looked at her. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Soren, at the 2 auditors, at Voss's warriors at the door. He sat back down. "I'll give the full accounting," he said. It took 2 hours. Celine sat at the side of the council table and listened to 9 years of Orveth's careful constructed architecture being dismantled piece by piece under Aldith's formal questioning. And she did not feel triumph while she listened, because triumph was the emotion of someone who had been fighting, and she had not been fighting. She had been building. The distinction mattered to her, not for philosophical reasons, but for practical ones. You could not build clearly from a fighting posture. The two required different positions of the body and the mind. And she had been in a building posture since she walked out of the palace window 6 days ago. She was still building. While Orveth spoke, Marin came down from the gallery and sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly correct. At the hour mark, Voss moved from the doors to the council table edge and stood there with his arms crossed and his face doing the specific thing it did when he was listening carefully and deciding what the information was worth. Harkon of Black Ridge had moved to the front row of the assembly floor. Her brother stood at her back the whole 2 hours. She did not look at him. She did not need to. When Orveth finished, Aldeth looked at the hall. "The Elder Council will deliberate," she said. "The full assembly will remain convened for the determination." The deliberation took 40 minutes. Celine knew it would be short because the documentation was complete, and the testimony was on the record, and the outcome of a complete documentary case before a full council was not a matter of debate, but of procedure. Aldith knew how to run a procedure. The determination, when it came, was read by Aldith in the flat, precise voice of a woman reading legal language and not editorializing it. All charges against Celine Ashcroft dismissed. Orveth removed from the Elder Council pending criminal review. Vivienne Crest stripped of all titles and court standing, banned from the capital for a period of no less than 10 years. A full audit commission established for the trading consortium. And the last item, which Aldith read with the same flat precision as the others, which was the right way to read it. A formal record of the Kingdom Assembly's recognition that the evidence presented demonstrated that the former Luna had acted in the Kingdom's best interest in all matters brought before this review. On the record. For every pack in the kingdom within 30 days. The hall received the determination the way halls receive things that had been building for 2 hours, with a collective exhalation that was neither celebration nor grief, but something simpler than both, the sound of a suspended thing finally touching ground. Vivienne left through the main doors with 2 guards and did not look back. Celine watched her go and thought about the specific waste of it, not the scheme or the manufactured documents or the covenant, but the woman herself, who was 31 years old and had been handed to a plan by people who needed her face and her position, and who had used her the way men of that kind always use the instruments available to them, without particular regard for what happened to the instrument afterward. Vivienne had made her choices. Celine did not excuse them, but she could see the architecture of how those choices had been shaped, and the seeing of it produced something that was not quite pity and not quite recognition, but occupied the territory adjacent to both. She let that thought go. It was not hers to carry. The hall emptied over the next hour, pack representatives and their retinues moving out through the main doors in the organized noise of people who had witnessed something and were already processing what it meant for their own calculations. Voss came to her before he left. He stood in front of her with the weathered face and the scar under his jaw, and looked at her with the assessing eyes of a man who had said what he said in this hall and was not reconsidering it. "My pack's oath," he said. "The offer stands. When you're ready to receive it." She looked at him. "What I asked Darius for tonight will take time to build, the council structure, the pack representation mechanism. When it's built, North Pine gets a seat at the table equal to every other pack. Not above. Equal." "Equal is what I asked for," he said. "For 30 years. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry it took this long to reach someone who would give it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he did the thing she had not expected. He extended his hand, not in the formal pack grip, but palm up, which was the old Northern Territory gesture, the one that meant I give you my word not as a transaction, but as a fact, the kind of fact that does not require witnesses. She put her palm over his, held it. He left. Harkon came next, brief and direct, the way men from the Black Ridge Territory were always direct, with no unnecessary language. "My oath is yours," he said, "when the structure is ready," and walked out. The Eastern Clan delegates, the Northern Pack representatives she had ridden in with, 3 Border Pack elders she had not spoken to in years who came to her in the emptying hall and said, in various registers and levels of directness, the same essential thing. They had been watching what she did for years, and they had come today to see what she would do with it, and they had seen it. She accepted each of them with the same even directness she had brought to every other part of this morning, not performing humility, not performing triumph, just receiving what was offered with the clarity of someone who knew what it was worth and what it obligated. Her brother waited until the hall was nearly empty. Then he came around to face her, and she looked at him, at the scar and the road dust, and the face that was their father's face in the jaw and their mother's in the eyes. And she said, "You didn't have to come." "I know," he said. "How long have you known about the debt?" "Since I was 19. He said it without apology. "Father told me not to tell you." "Why?" Edrin looked at her. The jaw tightened. Their father's tell in their father's jaw, which she had apparently inherited along with the steady voice and the early morning capacity for work. "He said you'd spend your whole life carrying it if you knew. Said you were the kind of person who carried things." A pause. He wasn't wrong. She thought about her father, the east-facing room, the property deed, the letter to herself that he had never read, but that she had written the way he might have written it, in his voice, which was her voice. "He was right," she said. "And he was wrong. I would have carried it, but I would have carried it without it being able to hit me from behind." Edrin looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. A single nod. The same acknowledgement their father had given when he understood something and was not going to argue with it. "I should have told you years ago." "Yes," she said. They stood in the nearly empty hall with the cold light coming through the high windows and the formal record still open on the council table, and Celine looked at her brother who had ridden several days without stopping to stand beside her in a room where she had not known she needed him until he walked through the door. And she felt something she almost never let herself feel inside a working context, which was simply the warmth of not being alone in a way that had nothing to do with alliances or documentation. She had built so much alone, had been good at the alone of it, had taken a kind of sustenance from the self-sufficiency, the way you took sustenance from things you were genuinely good at. But there was a difference between being capable of alone and preferring it, and she had confused the two for a long time because the capable of it had always been required. "Stay," she said, "for a while. There's a lot of structure to build." He looked at the empty hall, at the formal record, at the door through which Voss had left, and Harkon had left, and the Eastern delegates had left, and the kingdom had left to carry the morning's events back to their territories. "What are you building exactly?" "Something that doesn't depend on one person holding it," she said. "Something that has architecture." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. "Father would have said you always thought like an engineer." He would have meant it as a criticism. He would have meant it as both. She almost smiled. The approximation of a smile, in the nearly empty hall, in the cold light, with her brother beside her. The first thing in several days that had occupied the space where a smile went without having to be decided into existence. The hall was empty except for them when Darius came back. He had left during the deliberation. She had noticed his absence from the dais and had processed it as his own navigation of the morning and had not tracked him further. He came back through the service corridor, the same door she had entered through, which meant he had been somewhere in the administrative wing, and he came back alone, without the guard detail, in the same plain way he had walked to her on the center floor. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her brother. Edrin looked at Darius for a long moment, with the specific look of an older brother who had ridden several days to stand beside his sister and who had read a criminal accusation with his sister's name on it, and who was currently deciding how much of his personal opinion about the morning's events to communicate through facial expression. He communicated a significant amount. Then he looked at Celine. "I'll be in the east courtyard," he said, and walked out through the main doors. Darius came into the hall. He walked to where she was standing, not 6 feet this time, but closer, stopping when she did not move backward, stopping at the distance where they had always spoken in working hours, close enough for private conversation, the distance of practical proximity rather than intimacy, because in 14 years the practical had always been the architecture of everything. He looked at her face, her hair, the riding clothes, the absence of every formal marker. "I told Orvith an hour ago that the criminal review was closed before I received the council's determination," he said. "He told me it was procedurally too far advanced to close. I told him it was my review under my name and I was closing it." She looked at him. "I'm telling you because it matters to me that you know I tried to close it before the outcome," he said. "Not because it changes what I did. It doesn't change what I did." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. In the cold light, with the empty hall around them, he looked older than the dais version of himself. Not worse for it. More accurate. The way a thing looked more accurate when all the performance was stripped from it and you were left with the actual dimensions. "I've been thinking about what you said on the center floor," he said. "You told me not to ask you in this hall." "I did. I'm asking you in this hall anyway," he said, "because this is the only hall where every witness is gone and the record is closed and what I say goes nowhere except where you take it." He looked at her directly. "Come back." She looked at him. She had known this was coming. She had known it was coming the way you knew the shape of a thing from its shadow. Not the exact form, but the general truth of it. She had prepared for it in the specific way she had learned to prepare for conversations that mattered, by deciding, before they happened, what she actually wanted and what she was actually willing to give, so that the wanting of the other person in the room would not reorganize her answer. She knew what she wanted. She knew what she was willing to give. They were not the same thing. "Not the way it was," she said. He absorbed that, did not argue with it or around it. "Tell me what it would be." "A ruling council. PAC representation with genuine authority, not advisory weight. The Ironmere structure stays closed. The relief allocation mechanism becomes permanent and goes into the kingdom charter." She held his gaze. "And my seat at the governance table is mine because of what I bring to it, not because I'm bonded to the king. Not as a Luna. As a member of the council with equal standing to every other seat." He was quiet. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had always been good at waiting because she had learned young that the person who could not tolerate silence in a negotiation was the person who made concessions before they needed to. "The council," he said, "the structure you want. That takes away a significant portion of what the Crown currently holds unilaterally. Yes, she said, you know that. I designed it to. That's the point. She looked at him steadily. A crown that holds everything unilaterally is one man's judgment, one man's vanity, one man's susceptibility to a prepared story and a manufactured document. She did not inflect the last sentence. She did not need to. A council with pack representation is 17 different judgments. Harder to fool, harder to move, harder to hollow out from the inside by people who know that one man's attention is the only variable they need to capture. Darius looked at the floor, at the formal record on the council table, at the hall around them that had held 400 witnesses 2 hours ago and now held 2 people in an empty afternoon. I was afraid, he said. Quiet. The kind of quiet that costs something to produce. When the documents appeared, I was afraid of what they meant, and I was afraid of what it would mean to... I was already sitting in rooms that felt like they'd had the walls pulled out, and then the documents were there, and they gave me somewhere to put the fear. He raised his eyes. That is not an excuse. I know the difference between an explanation and an excuse. She looked at him, at the amber eyes and the pale jaw, and the sleepless face of a man who had arrived by a very long and costly route, at the specific kind of honesty that was only possible when everything you had been using to avoid it was finally gone. She believed him. Believing him was not the same as the believing changing what needed to be built. She had learned the hard way that the emotional truth of a moment and the structural requirements of the future were separate considerations and had to be kept separate, or the emotional truth borrowed against the future and the future came up short. She had borrowed against her future for 14 years. She was not going to do it again. I believe you, she said, and the council structure is non-negotiable. He held her gaze for a long moment. In his eyes, she could see the full accounting of the morning, the assembly, the testimony, Orveth's 2 hours, Voss at the door, her brother's scar, the empty hall, and beneath the accounting, the specific grief of a man who understood, with a precision that had not been available to him before today, exactly what he had spent 14 years failing to see. He had not seen it. He had not seen her. Not fully. He had seen the results of her work and called them the kingdom's natural functioning, and he had seen the woman who managed his rooms and his correspondence and his alliances and had called her the Luna, and somewhere in the distance between the work and the seeing of it, he had lost the specific person doing it and replaced her with the position she held, and that was not cruelty, but it was a kind of blindness that had the same effect as cruelty in the end. He knew that now. Knowing it now was not restitution. But it was, she thought, the beginning of something more durable than restitution. Restitution was a debt paid and closed. What she saw in his face was the beginning of understanding, the kind that did not go away because you could not unlearn it, the kind that changed the person who had it, and therefore changed the future they were capable of building. That was worth something. She was not certain yet how much. I'll draft the council charter, she said. It'll take 3 weeks. When the draft is complete, I'll bring it to the Capitol, and you'll have 4 days to review it and return it with proposed amendments. The amendments come back to me. If the final structure is acceptable to both of us, I'll sign it. If it's not, we negotiate until it is, or until one of us concludes the negotiation is not going to produce something workable. She paused. When the charter is signed, and only when it's signed, I'll consider what form my role in this kingdom takes going forward. My terms, my timeline. Darius looked at her for a long time. Then he said, all right, 2 words, flat and final, no negotiation in them, no counter-proposal, no attempt to revise the terms towards something more comfortable. 2 words that meant he understood that the comfortable version of this was not on offer and had decided, somewhere in the morning's long accounting, that the uncomfortable version was worth more than no version. She nodded once. She picked up the 8 pages of institutional knowledge from the council table where she had left them, and the property deed, and the treaty archive certification, and she stacked them neatly and held them against her side. She left Veyrath's testimony and the audit documents where they were for the formal record. She walked toward the main doors. She stopped once, not at the door, halfway across the empty hall in the cold light from the high windows. She stopped and turned back and looked at him standing in the center floor where he had walked to her this morning, where Voss had stood, where she had delivered 14 years of invisible work into public evidence and watched it be received. Darius, she said. He looked at her. The Eastern Province drought relief, she said. The allocation that went through last winter. One of your palace guard captains has family on the beneficiary list. She held his gaze. He rode out of the capital the night the accusation was issued to bring me the document rather than intercept me. He did that at his own risk. Whatever review touches the palace guard in the coming weeks, his files should be clean. Darius was quiet for a moment. Aldrich, he said. His files should be clean, she said again, and turned and walked to the doors. Her brother was in the east courtyard with 2 horses and the road dust still on his coat, and a patience that their father had given him in some form she had not inherited or had inherited differently. The patience of a man who could wait without cataloging what the waiting cost. He handed her the reins of her horse without a word.